Picture it. Ancient Athens, around the 5th century BCE. You've just walked through the city gates, probably with dust clinging to your sandals and the smell of roasted fish mixing uncomfortably with, let's call it, street freshness. The city hums with energy. Thousands of voices, carts creaking, animals braying, vendors shouting over each other. It's loud, it's messy, and it's alive. This is the birthplace of democracy, philosophy, and some of the greatest art and architecture in history. It's also the birthplace of stubbed toes on uneven cobblestones, constant noise, and a healthy coating of grime. Athens was a city of contradictions, brilliance and filth, genius and chaos, ideals and reality. Hello, travelers. Histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button. But only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. When we think of Athens, we imagine marble temples, men in togas, and the great thinkers debating the meaning of life. That's true, but that's the highlight reel. The blooper reel included overcrowded alleys, disease, and more goats than you'd ever want as neighbors. Athens was both the glittering jewel of the Greek world and the place where you couldn't walk 10 feet without tripping over a water jug or someone's laundry. That contradiction was part of its magic. Imagine being surrounded by buildings like the Parthenon, hearing Socrates question people about truth and justice, while also having to step around donkey droppings on your way there. Democracy. Meat dung. Athens liked to call itself the most democratic city on earth, and in some ways it was, if you were a male citizen, over 18 with 2 Athenian parents. Congratulations, you had a say in politics. But that left out women, slaves and foreigners, metics, who made up the majority of the population. The irony, the city of the free was kept running by the unfree. Slaves carried water, cooked meals, mined silver, and did all the jobs Athenians considered beneath them. Without them, the system would collapse faster than a drunk man at a Dionysian festival. Democracy was loud, proud, and public, but only for a carefully selected slice of society. It's like bragging about an all-you-can-eat buffet, but only letting in a third of the people standing outside. The rest? They're the ones cooking the food and washing the dishes. Now, democracy in Athens wasn't some quiet vote in a booth. It was loud. Citizens gathered in the assembly, sometimes thousands of them, and shouted their opinions until decisions were made. If you think modern politics gets noisy, imagine trying to pass laws while competing with vendors yelling about fresh olives just down the street. Athens was one of the first places where political debate spilled out into daily life. People argued in workshops, in markets, on street corners. In theory, it was uplifting. Citizens engaged in civic duty. In practice, it was a shouting match. Democracy in action meant everyone yelling at once, kind of like social media, but smellier. And yet, despite the chaos, Athens was stunning. White marble temples gleamed on the Acropolis. Statues of gods and heroes lined streets and sanctuaries. The city was alive with art, festivals, and theatre. Where else could you stumble from a fishmonger's stall to an open-air performance of a brand-new play by Sophocles? But beauty came with a catch. Sanitation wasn't exactly top tier. Streets were narrow and often unpaved. Waste disposal was primitive. If you're lucky, someone dumped it in a ditch instead of your doorstep. The same streets that saw dazzling processions also hosted rats and mud puddles. Athens was both dazzling and disgusting, sometimes within the same breath. It's the equivalent of living next to the Louvre while your bathroom doesn't have plumbing. For Athenians, contradiction was everywhere. The city loved reason and debate, yet religion filled every corner with shrines, rituals, and omens. Rational philosophy coexisted with people consulting oracles and sacrificing goats to keep the gods happy. You could go from a high-minded discussion about virtue to a neighbor warning you not to walk under ladders because Hermes might get offended. There was also a contrast between the ideals of moderation, the famous Greek nothing in excess, and the reality of street festivals where people drank so much wine they ended up sleeping it off on temple steps. Balance was preached, chaos was practiced. Contradictions aside, Athens had an irresistible energy. Walk the streets and you'd hear a chorus of languages as traders came from all over the Mediterranean. You'd see workshops hammering away at pottery and metalwork, each producing goods admired far beyond Greece. You'd encounter street performers juggling or playing music, while kids ran around with hoops or knucklebones. The streets were dusty, loud, and unpredictable, but they pulsed with life. To live in Athens was to be constantly overstimulated, politically, socially, and yes, olfactorily. So what was Athens really? A city of contradictions, the cradle of democracy, but also a place where most people had no say, a hub of art and learning, but also one where waste disposal was throw it out the window. A dazzling city of marble, but also of mud. It's easy to look back and think of Athens as perfect, gleaming temples, noble speeches, great thinkers. The reality was more complicated, more chaotic, and much more human. And maybe that's the point. The greatness of Athens didn't exist despite its contradictions. It existed because of them. Out of the messiness came ideas and institutions that would shape the world. The good news? You're alive in ancient Athens. The bad news? So are the fleas and flies. Imagine stepping into ancient Athens with an errand to run. Maybe you promised a friend you'd meet him at a potter's workshop, or perhaps you're looking for a philosopher who insists on talking circles around you about justice. The problem? There's no such thing as a street address, no neat grid of numbers, no glowing blue dot on a phone to guide you, not even a map you could pick up at the city gates. Athens was a maze, and navigating it was equal parts patience, persistence, and prayer to Hermes, the god of travelers. Finding a place in Athens meant relying on memory, landmarks, and the kind of directions that sound like riddles. Turn left at the olive tree that looks like it's judging you, then walk until you smell the fishmongers. If you asked 3 locals where to find someone, you might get 4 different answers, none of them correct. The city grew without much of a plan, more like a ball of yarn unraveled by a particularly enthusiastic kitten. Streets twisted, curved, and dead-ended with no clear logic. They weren't laid out by master urban designers. They evolved over time as houses and workshops sprang up wherever there was space. Narrow alleys cut between homes, some so tight that you'd have to turn sideways if a donkey was coming the other way. Main thoroughfares weren't much better, clogged with carts, animals, and clusters of people debating loudly about politics. If you were new in town, you either learned fast or got lost endlessly, becoming that foreigner who kept circling the same shrine for hours. Because there were no house numbers, Athenians relied heavily on landmarks. Temples, fountains, or prominent workshops acted as reference points. Directions usually went something like, "His house is near the shrine of Hermes next to the place where the tanner dumps his hides." Not exactly precise, but enough to get you close. Of course, the problem with landmarks is that they were constantly changing. A stall might move, a workshop might close, and suddenly your carefully memorized directions were useless. If you've ever gone to meet a friend who tells you I'm right by the Starbucks, only to discover there are 5 Starbucks within 2 blocks, congratulations, you've experienced a small taste of Athens. This lack of fixed addresses also made communication tricky. There was no postal service like the one Rome later developed. If you wanted to send a message, you either hired a slave or a runner to deliver it, or you trusted word of mouth. But word of mouth has its flaws. A message could be delayed, forgotten, or hilariously mangled. Imagine sending an invitation to dinner, only for the messenger to mix up the landmarks, and your guest ends up at a random blacksmith's house, politely wondering when the appetizers will arrive. Merchants faced their own challenges. Advertising your business in Athens wasn't as simple as putting up a sign with a street number. Many used painted symbols, carvings, or distinctive decorations outside their workshops to help customers find them. A cobbler might hang a sandal over his doorway, while a wine seller might place an amphora outside. It was practical branding in a world without Yelp reviews. Still, if a customer forgot which street had the sandal and wandered into another cobbler's shop, there wasn't much you could do except try to sell them something anyway. And then there were the tourists. the visitors who flocked to Athens to see its famous temples, theatres, and festivals. Without guides, they were hopelessly lost. Professional guides eventually did spring up, offering tours and directions, but until then the streets were a labyrinth. A bewildered foreigner wandering into the wrong neighborhood might be greeted with suspicion, curiosity, or, if unlucky, a pickpocket. Athens was a cosmopolitan city, yes, but it wasn't always forgiving to strangers with bad sense of direction. Yet despite the confusion, Athenians got by. People relied on memory, habit, and community knowledge. You might not know the exact address of your friend's house, but the baker on the corner knew, and so did the woman at the fountain, and so did the neighbor leaning out the window yelling at her children. Information traveled along the grapevine, and while it wasn't efficient, it was social. Asking for directions wasn't just practical, it was part of daily life. A stranger might stop you, ask about a certain sculptor's workshop, and in the process you'd chat, swap gossip, and maybe even make a friend. Of course, this made Athens both charming and maddening. You could spend half a day trying to find someone, only to discover they weren't home when you finally arrived. Still, there's something oddly fitting about a city devoted to debate and discussion having streets that practically forced you to stop and talk to people. Athens didn't make navigation easy, but it did make it social. And so, the city without street signs thrived, its chaos somehow functional. If you wanted order, you probably would have preferred Sparta, where everything was more rigid. But Athens wasn't about straight lines and clear answers. It was about messy brilliance, winding streets, and neighbors who always had a story to tell, even if they couldn't give you decent directions. The next time you complain about your GPS sending you down the wrong road, remember, in ancient Athens, that was the system, and honestly, at least your GPS doesn't argue with you about democracy while you're lost. Take a walk through Athens, they said. It'll be inspiring, they said, and sure you'll get your share of inspiration. Grand temples looming in the distance, bustling workshops clanging away. But your feet will remind you of the less glamorous truth. Most Athenian streets were nothing more than dirt paths. Forget marble-paved boulevards or tidy cobblestones. Those were rare luxuries reserved for special spots like certain sacred areas. The rest? Picture uneven, dusty tracks, beaten down by sandals, donkey hooves, and wagon wheels. Athens was the intellectual capital of the ancient world, but when it came to infrastructure, it often felt like the city was still waiting for the construction crew to show up. The lack of pavement made every change in weather an adventure. On dry days, dust swirled through the streets, coating skin, clothes, and lungs in a fine powder. Walking across town left you looking like you'd just spent an afternoon rolling in flour. It was an unavoidable part of daily life, a kind of gritty seasoning sprinkled into every bite of food. Dinner with friends? Expect your olives with a side of dust. Public speeches in the agora? Good luck not coughing dramatically while some statesman makes his point about justice. The Athenians probably didn't need incense at religious rituals. The dust cloud provided all the atmosphere you could want. And then came the rain. Athens doesn't have the tropical downpours you might find in other parts of the world. But when it rained, the dirt streets transformed into ankle-deep mud pits. What had been dusty annoyance in summer became a sludgy obstacle course in winter. Mud stuck to sandals until they felt like lead weights. Carts got bogged down and had to be pushed or abandoned. Children slipped and tumbled, while animals left hoofprints that hardened into awkward craters when the sun returned. For anyone trying to get somewhere, progress slowed to a miserable trudge. Some streets had rudimentary drainage ditches, but they clogged easily, and without consistent upkeep they often overflowed, turning neighborhoods into impromptu ponds. Congratulations, you've just invented the slip-and-slide Athenian edition. The wealthy, of course, had ways to minimize the chaos. Houses belonging to the upper classes were often set back from the busiest roads, tucked behind courtyards or walls. That didn't make the mud disappear, but it meant fewer donkey carts splashing filth onto your doorway. Ordinary Athenians, however, had no such luxury. If your home opened directly onto the street, you lived with dust clouds in your face in summer and muddy puddles at your doorstep in winter. Shoes helped. but even those weren't a guarantee. You might just end up losing one to the muck, much to the amusement of passing children. Merchants and craftsmen had it even harder. Imagine trying to sell fish, bread, or pottery while your shopfront doubled as a dust storm staging area. Rain was even worse: soggy goods, slippery floors, and mud tracked in by every customer. Some shopkeepers scattered straw in front of their stalls to soak up moisture or tamp down dust. But it was a losing battle. Athens might have been a hub of commerce, but it wasn't exactly retail-friendly when your front entrance resembled a swamp. And let's not forget the animals. Donkeys, horses, goats, and dogs all contributed to the state of the streets, not just with their hooves but with their droppings. Pavement might have helped with cleanliness, but in dirt lanes, waste simply mixed into the mud or turned into little surprises waiting to be kicked. Navigating an Athenian street wasn't just about watching your step, it was about survival strategy. Do you risk the deep puddle or the suspicious-looking mound? Choose wisely. One interesting consequence of these unpaved roads was the constant noise. Wagons creaked and rattled unevenly over hard-packed dirt. Hooves clopped irregularly, sandals shuffled, and when it rained, there was the constant squelch of mud underfoot. Pavement might have offered a smooth ride, but Athens embraced the soundtrack of chaos. The city sounded alive because it literally couldn't sound quiet. Of course, the lack of pavement wasn't just inconvenient, it was symbolic. Athens poured enormous wealth and effort into building temples, theatres, and monuments, but left everyday infrastructure lagging. The Parthenon gleamed atop the Acropolis, while just below, citizens sloshed through mud on their way to admire it. It's as if the city was saying, practical comfort, not important; eternal glory, absolutely essential. Priorities were clear, if a little inconvenient for anyone doing laundry. Yet, in a strange way, the lack of pavement contributed to the very character of Athens. Life on dirt streets forced Athenians to adapt, to improvise, to deal with discomfort. The same citizens who debated philosophy and democracy also knew how to scrape dried mud off their sandals with a stick. The resilience built from living in such conditions was part of the city's spirit. It reminded everyone, rich, poor, or somewhere in between, that Athens was a living, breathing, messy place, not just an idealized marble postcard. So the next time you grumble about potholes or cracked sidewalks, spare a thought for Athens. There, the whole road was basically one long pothole, changing personality with the weather, dry, dusty, muddy, or noisy. Every walk was unpredictable. Life in Athens wasn't about smooth roads. It was about enduring the bumps, laughing at the slips, and reminding yourself that somewhere out there, even Socrates probably ruined a sandal in the mud. If you thought navigating Athens' dirt streets was tough, try adding in the fact that you were never ever alone. The streets were rarely empty, and most of the time they were downright packed. Citizens, slaves, foreigners, children, animals, merchants, philosophers, and travelers, all crammed into the same twisting lanes, moving at their own pace and with their own priorities. Athens wasn't just a city, it was a living organism, loud, crowded, unpredictable, and occasionally smelly enough to make you wonder if the gods were testing your endurance. Rush hour in Athens wasn't just a couple of hours in the morning or evening, it was the entire day, from dawn until dusk. The city pulsed with motion. At sunrise, the streets already began to stir. Farmers and traders streamed in from the countryside, driving carts laden with olives, figs, or amphorae filled with wine. Slaves followed behind, balancing loads of wood, water, or baskets of produce. Shopkeepers set up their stalls, hammering, clattering, and shouting their wares. Before the city had even had time to properly yawn, the streets were full of traffic, human and otherwise. The real mix, though, was in the sheer diversity of people. Citizens strutted through the streets with a sense of ownership. They were the men who could vote, debate, and hold office, and many made a show of walking with confidence, whether or not they were just heading to buy bread. Alongside them moved slaves, sometimes dozens in tow, carrying goods or rushing to complete errands. And then came the metics, the resident foreigners who lived and worked in Athens but weren't full citizens. They ran businesses, crafted tools, sold goods, and added to the constant bustle. Add in visitors from other Greek city-states, or even farther afield from places like Egypt or Persia, and the streets of Athens could feel like a miniature version of the Mediterranean world squeezed into a few winding lanes. And then, of course, there were the animals. Donkeys carried goods, oxen pulled carts, and dogs roamed freely. Chickens scuttled underfoot, goats wandered through alleys, and every so often, a stubborn mule would stop in the middle of the road and refuse to budge, creating an ancient traffic jam. If you've ever been stuck behind a delivery truck parked diagonally across the street, congratulations, you've essentially relived an Athenian morning, minus the goat bleating. Crowds brought more than just inconvenience, they brought risk. Pickpockets thrived in the chaos, slipping through the press of bodies to snatch coins, bread, or anything else worth carrying. Beggars staked out busy corners calling out for alms. Street performers competed for attention, juggling or playing flutes in hopes of earning a coin, often right where traffic was thickest. In short, every step was a gamble between getting where you needed to go and being distracted or delayed by the colorful, chaotic swirl around you. The Agora, Athens' central marketplace, was the epicenter of this crowd dynamic. Thousands of people flowed through it daily, buying, selling, debating, and gossiping. It was where merchants set up their stalls, politicians courted the public, and philosophers cornered anyone unlucky enough to make eye contact. It wasn't just a market, it was the city's stage, and everyone played a part. But the Agora was only one hotspot. Even the narrowest residential lanes could feel like they were bursting at the seams, especially when neighbors leaned out of their windows to chat, or when a funeral procession squeezed its way past carts and children. Noise added to the sense of density. Crowds meant constant chatter, shouts from sellers, and the rhythmic clatter of sandals on dirt. Animals contributed their own soundtrack. Donkeys brayed, dogs barked, and chickens squawked indignantly as they dodged human feet. Add the sound of tools from workshops, and the occasional argument escalating into a street brawl, and you had a symphony of chaos echoing off clay walls. Silence was a rare commodity, and if you wanted peace, your best bet was to climb the hills outside the city. Despite the crush, Athenians adapted. People developed an unspoken rhythm to the streets, weaving between carts, slipping past slower walkers, and occasionally shouting at someone who blocked the way. It was a dance of sorts, part patience, part assertiveness, and part sheer luck. For visitors it was overwhelming, but for Athenians it was simply life. To grow up in Athens was to learn to navigate crowds with agility, awareness, and the occasional sharp elbow. The sheer press of people also gave the city its vibrancy. Crowds weren't just obstacles, they were opportunities. News spread quickly as people swapped gossip in the streets. Political opinions were shaped not just in formal assemblies but in overheard arguments. A crowded street was a marketplace of ideas as much as goods. If you wanted to feel the pulse of the city, you didn't go to a temple or a monument, you went into the crush and listened. Yet there was also frustration. Anyone trying to get somewhere in a hurry quickly learned that Athens had no concept of personal space. The press of bodies could be exhausting, the noise overwhelming, and the endless jostling an invitation for tempers to flare. But just like the dust and mud, the crowds were part of what made Athens what it was, alive, unpredictable, and full of constant motion. So yes, rush hour was basically all day, every day. Athens' streets weren't calm boulevards where people strolled peacefully. They were a crush of humans and animals, a flowing river of energy that never really slowed. To live there was to accept the crowd as your daily companion, sometimes irritating, sometimes entertaining, always unavoidable. And maybe, just maybe, it was that restless press of life that made Athens the heartbeat of the ancient world. In Athens, water wasn't just a necessity, it was a social event. Public fountains dotted the city, carved from stone and fed by aqueducts or springs, serving as the beating heart of neighborhoods. They were the spots where households collected their daily supply of water, but they also doubled as meeting places, rumor exchanges, and stages for the kind of informal chatter that kept Athens buzzing. If you picture a modern office water cooler where co-workers linger to share the latest news, Add a crowd of women balancing clay jars, slaves rushing with buckets, and a few curious bystanders eavesdropping, you'll get the Athenian version, except louder, wetter, and with zero privacy. Fetching water was often women's work, which meant the fountains were places where female Athenians could step into the public eye, however briefly. For many women of citizen families, whose lives were largely confined to the home, a trip to the fountain was one of the rare daily chances to socialize outside the household. They chatted with neighbors, compared notes about food, husbands, or festivals, and swapped stories that often flowed faster than the water itself. Slaves, too, were ever present, dispatched to haul heavy amphorae back to households. These errands turned fountains into miniature melting pots, where citizens, servants, and foreigners briefly crossed paths in a space everyone needed. The design of the fountains themselves varied. Some were simple stone basins with spouts, others grander structures adorned with carvings or columns. Certain fountains even had covered porticos, allowing people to linger in the shade as they waited their turn. The city prided itself on these constructions, not only as practical solutions to the ever-present thirst of thousands, but as symbols of civic wealth and order. After all, a well-fed fountain was a visible reminder that Athens could harness nature for the benefit of its people. Nothing said civilized like water that didn't have to be scooped straight from a muddy stream. But for all their elegance, the fountains were never serene. The atmosphere was often crowded and chaotic, with long lines of people balancing clay jars, sometimes jostling for position. Children scampered around, splashing in puddles despite being shooed away. Dogs slurped at the runoff, while donkeys stood nearby, waiting impatiently for their owners. The sound of water mingled with laughter, complaints, and heated gossip. It was lively, unpredictable, and occasionally testy. If someone cut the line, an argument could erupt that drew in half the square. The social function of fountains can't be overstated. They were the informal news networks of Athens. Political debates overheard in the agora might trickle down to the fountains in the form of gossip. Rumors of new laws, scandals, or foreign visitors traveled from ear to ear as women and slaves filled their jars. If a neighbor's husband had been spotted drunk at a symposium, or if a family was rumored to be in financial trouble, chances are the fountain crowd knew before anyone else. In this way, fountains were the pulse of the city's private life, carrying information across households faster than any messenger. Poets and playwrights occasionally referenced fountains for this very reason. They symbolized not just water, but the constant chatter that defined communal life. To meet at a fountain wasn't simply to quench your thirst. It was to participate in the social fabric of the city. A walk to the fountain could deliver a jug of water and half a dozen new stories, whether you asked for them or not. There was also a ritualistic side to fountains. Since water was tied to purity in Greek religion, fountains often had a sacred element, dedicated to nymphs or gods. People sometimes left offerings, garlands, small figurines, or coins as tokens of thanks. Certain festivals even included processions that featured trips to well-known fountains, underscoring their importance beyond the purely practical. They weren't just plumbing fixtures, they were threads connecting the spiritual, social, and practical needs of Athens. Of course, not every Athenian viewed fountains with the same enthusiasm. For those tasked with the hard labor of carrying water, mostly women and slaves, they could represent drudgery. Clay jars weren't light, especially once filled, and the repeated treks between home and fountain were exhausting. Yet even in this core, there was an element of community. Shared burdens often sparked shared laughter, jokes, or even friendships. The complaint about heavy jars might be universal, but so was the relief of taking a breather with others before the long trudge back. From a modern perspective, it's tempting to see fountains as charming, communal relics of a simpler time, but to an Athenian, they were vital lifelines. Without them, daily life simply couldn't function. Wells existed, but they were often private or unreliable. Springs on the city's edge were too far for constant use. Fountains centralized the most basic human need, water, right where the community needed it, transforming necessity into opportunity for connection. In the end, fountains weren't only about hydration, they were about communication. They embodied the contradictions of Athenian life, a city famed for its lofty debates and democratic ideals, yet just as defined by the small, everyday exchanges that took place while waiting in line with a clay jug. At a fountain, politics and philosophy might fade into the background, replaced by the latest neighborhood scandal or recipe for better bread. And in their own way, these conversations kept the city running just as much as the flow of water did. So if the agora was the brain of Athens, the fountains were its gossiping heart. They quenched thirst, spread news, and reminded everyone that community wasn't built only in assemblies or temples, but also in the splash and chatter of daily life. The original water cooler, just wetter, heavier, and with no guarantee the person next to you wouldn't spill half a jar on your sandals. Step into the agora, and you'll immediately feel as if the entire city has been crammed into one giant open-air living room. This wasn't just a marketplace. It was the very heartbeat of Athens, where commerce, politics, philosophy, and everyday life collided in a spectacle of noise, color, and chaos. Imagine if Walmart, your local farmer's market, and a TED Talk stage all fused together, but with goats wandering through the aisles and a philosopher ready to argue with you about the definition of justice while you're just trying to buy figs. That was the agora, practical and profound, crowded and chaotic, a place where you could walk in for groceries and walk out questioning the meaning of existence. The agora sat in the center of the city, an open square ringed by stoas, long colonnaded buildings, where merchants set up stalls, officials gathered, and philosophers lingered in search of unsuspecting conversational prey. From early morning, the square filled with vendors hawking goods at top volume. Bakers piled up loaves of bread, fishmongers laid out their catch, potters displayed gleaming jars, and farmers hauled in baskets of olives and fruit. If you think modern salespeople are pushy, try resisting a Greek vendor who believed shouting louder was a valid business strategy. You'd hear cries of fresh fish, or best oil in Athens, echoing across the square, all while competing with the braying of donkeys delivering goods. Animals were part of the scene too. Dogs darted between stalls hoping for scraps. Chickens flapped indignantly as children chased them. Goats nibbled on anything left within reach. Even oxen made appearances, dragging carts into the square before being unhitched to stand lazily in the sun. Shopping in the agora meant weaving not only through crowds of humans, but also dodging animals with their own agenda. It was less a cleanly organized supermarket than a living, breathing zoo that happened to sell olives. But the agora wasn't only about commerce, it was a stage for ideas. Philosophers made the space their playground. Socrates himself was notorious for hanging around, striking up conversations with anyone who'd listen or couldn't escape fast enough. He'd ask a simple question, "What is courage?" And before you knew it, you'd forgotten about your errands and were knee-deep in an existential debate. Other thinkers, like sophists, offered lessons for a fee, turning the agora into a kind of pop-up university, where learning came mixed with bargaining for fresh figs. Politics also thrived here. Though the official assembly met elsewhere, much of the groundwork for decisions happened in the agora's buzzing atmosphere. Citizens gathered to discuss proposed laws, gossip about leaders, or listen to speakers giving impromptu speeches. For the politically inclined, the agora was a hunting ground for persuasion, networking, and propaganda. Graffiti or public notices were plastered on walls, announcing upcoming trials, new decrees, or simply airing opinions with varying levels of artistry. If you wanted to feel the pulse of democracy, you didn't read a newspaper. You went to the agora and listened. The sheer variety of people was staggering. Merchants from across Greece and beyond brought exotic goods, Egyptian papyrus, Persian textiles, Thracian slaves. Athenians mingled with foreigners, while beggars hovered at the edges, hoping for alms. Street performers competed for attention, juggling or playing flutes, while fortune-tellers offered glimpses of the future to those willing to pay. Priests sometimes performed small rituals at shrines dotting the square, reminding everyone that religion was never far from daily life. It was a place where the sacred, the mundane and the absurd coexisted, and nobody seemed to mind. Noise was constant. Vendors shouted, animals bleated, Philosophers debated and customers argued over prices. The clatter of pottery, the clang of metalwork, and the shuffling of countless feet turned the agora into a sensory overload. Silence simply didn't exist there. If you came for peace and quiet, you left disappointed. If you came for energy and connection, you left exhilarated and maybe slightly poorer. What made the agora particularly unique was its role as the great equalizer. Rich and poor rubbed elbows in the same square. A wealthy aristocrat might bargain for fine imported cloth right next to a farmer haggling for grain, while their homes and lifestyles were worlds apart. In the agora, everyone participated in the same noisy dance of buying, selling, and arguing. Even if social divisions still mattered, the marketplace blurred the lines more than any other space in the city. For many Athenians, a trip to the agora was less about necessity and more about connection. Sure, you could stock up on food or supplies, but you could also hear the latest political rumor, encounter a traveling merchant with strange goods, or get pulled into an impromptu performance. It was as much about spectacle as shopping, as much about conversation as commerce. In a city that thrived on debate and drama, the agora was the stage where ordinary people lived those values every day. Of course, it wasn't without its frustrations. Prices fluctuated wildly. Goods sometimes spoiled in the heat, and crowds could be overwhelming. You might arrive intending to buy bread and end up stuck in a heated argument between two philosophers about whether virtue could be taught. But that unpredictability was also the charm. The agora wasn't designed for efficiency, it was designed for life. So if the fountains were the gossip hubs of the neighborhoods, the agora was the grand theater of Athens itself. Noisy, messy, exhilarating and unmissable. It embodied everything about the city, the contradictions, the brilliance and the chaos. To walk through it was to experience Athens at full volume, where democracy met donkey carts and wisdom competed for space with wine jars. And if you left without at least one new story to tell, you probably hadn't been paying attention. Before you even saw Athens in its full bustling glory, you smelled it. The city didn't announce itself with a fanfare of trumpets or a line of gleaming marble buildings. It announced itself with an odor, or more accurately with dozens of odors colliding in the air all at once. A dizzying cocktail that clung to your clothes and refused to leave. For every pleasant scent, like warm bread wafting from a baker's oven, there was an equally offensive one, reminding you that urban life in the 5th century BCE wasn't for the faint of nose. One whiff, and you might thank the gods for blessing you with a stuffy head cold. Start with the good smells, because they did exist. The aroma of baking bread floated through many neighborhoods in the morning, as bakers fired their clay ovens to supply the city with loaves. The smell of roasted fish or sizzling meat skewers drifted from street vendors' braziers, making your stomach growl even if you'd just eaten. Perfumed oils and incense, imported from far-off lands, added exotic notes to the air, especially around temples where sacrifices and rituals kept the smoke curling skyward. These were the scents that could almost trick you into thinking Athens was a paradise. Warm bread, sweet incense, a touch of olive oil frying in the pan, and then reality hit you, usually carried on the same breeze. For every baker there was a tanner, someone working animal hides with a process that smelled like they had personally offended every god of cleanliness. Tanning required soaking hides in vats of urine and other pungent brews, and the stench clung to workshops, streets, and anyone unlucky enough to pass by. Fishmongers contributed their own fragrance, arranging their wares on open tables with no refrigeration in sight. A good catch meant plenty of sales, but by late afternoon, when the sun had done its work, you could smell the fish stalls long before you saw them. Animals added their contributions generously. Donkeys, goats, dogs and chickens roamed the streets freely, and none of them cared about public hygiene. Droppings littered the ground, mixing with dust on dry days or becoming part of the mud soup when it rained. Chickens scattered feathers, goats chewed and spit, and dogs sometimes dragged the remains of discarded food into alleys where it sat to rot. If Athens had had a tourism brochure, it would not have included the scent of goat surprise on its list of highlights. Sewage was another unavoidable note in the city's perfume. Without a modern sewage system, waste disposal was simple. Toss it into the street or into a nearby ditch. Chamber pots were emptied with little concern for what or who was below. Open drains carried away some of the filth, but in crowded neighborhoods, puddles of unpleasant liquid lingered stubbornly. The smell wasn't constant everywhere, but certain alleys had reputations you could identify with your nose long before you turned the corner. And then there were the crowds themselves. Thousands of people packed into a small area meant thousands of human bodies producing their own natural fragrances. Bathing wasn't unheard of. Public baths existed, and oil scrapers, dredgels were common tools, but daily showers were not on the agenda. Add in the summer sun beating down on packed streets, and the collective aroma of humanity was yet another layer in the city's olfactory mix. Religious rituals contributed too. Sacrifices at temples filled the air with burning meat and smoke. To some, it was a sacred scent, a reminder of devotion and community. To others, it was just one more smoky haze added to an already dense atmosphere. Firewood, too, played its part. Most households relied on it for cooking, so entire neighborhoods smelled faintly of charred wood and ash, pleasant in small doses, but overwhelming when multiplied by thousands of kitchens. Visitors often commented on the sensory overload of Athens, and smell was as much a part of that as sight or sound. The blend of odors told you exactly where you were, near a bakery, a fish stall, a tannery, or a less than hygienic alley. Athenians themselves seemed used to it, taking the smells as part of urban life. Complaints surely existed. Who wouldn't groan about living near a tannery? But the sheer variety of scents was simply accepted as the price of living in a crowded, thriving city. Interestingly, smell wasn't always considered just an annoyance. Incense was thought to please the gods, and perfumed oils were prized luxuries for personal grooming. Smells carried symbolic meaning, sweet scents linked to purity and divinity, foul ones tied to pollution or moral corruption. To Athenians, the city's odors weren't just random. They were reminders of the tension between the lofty ideals of their culture and the messy realities of everyday life. If you'd walked through Athens with a modern sense of hygiene, you'd probably hold your nose at every turn. But for Athenians, this was the scent of home. It was the smell of work being done, bread being baked, sacrifices being offered, and life being lived. Athens didn't smell like perfection. It smelled like humanity in all its noisy, messy, fragrant forms. So yes, fresh bread and incense mingled with sewage and goat droppings to create an Athenian perfume you couldn't escape. It wasn't bottled, it wasn't sold, and nobody in their right mind would have marketed it, but it was the authentic scent of the world's most famous city, and maybe, just maybe, those with bad sinuses had it the best deal of all. If you were hungry in Athens, you didn't always need to head home for a proper meal. The city's streets offered their own kind of culinary experience. Fast, cheap, and usually edible. This wasn't fine dining. There were no gilded banquets, no silverware, and certainly no Michelin stars. Instead, you got quick bites that ranged from surprisingly tasty to, "I'll regret this in the morning." Think of it as ancient fast food. Bread, olives, figs, fish skewers, and the occasional mystery snack that made you question your life choices. Bread was the undisputed backbone of Athenian street food. Cheap, filling, and easy to carry, loaves were sold at stalls and bakeries across the city. Some were plain, others flavored with sesame seeds or herbs, but all served as the basic fuel of the urban diet. People tore off chunks to munch as they walked, or paired bread with whatever small treats vendors offered. Street hawkers often balanced trays of loaves on their heads or shoulders, weaving through the crowd while shouting prices, ready to sell on the move. If today's city streets run on coffee, ancient Athens ran on bread. Then there were the olives. Athens was surrounded by groves, and olives were everywhere, pressed into oil, mashed into spreads, or simply eaten whole. Vendors scooped them from jars and sold them by the handful, dripping brine onto the ground as they worked. The salty, tangy bite of an olive paired perfectly with bread, creating the ancient equivalent of a quick snack combo. Figs, too, were a staple. Sweet, portable, and abundant. They offered a cheap burst of sugar to keep you going. Children especially loved figs, and vendors could be spotted handing them out by the basketful, their sticky sweetness clinging to fingers long after the fruit was gone. But the real treat for many was fish, specifically grilled skewers sold by street cooks. Small fish, or bits of meat, were speared on sticks and roasted over open flames, filling the air with smoky, savory aromas. These were the snacks that tempted passers-by the way a hot dog cart or taco stand might today. You could grab one, eat it as you walked, and feel like you'd indulged in something special without breaking the bank. Of course, the freshness of the fish was variable. Buy in the morning, and you might get a delicious, lightly charred skewer. Buy in the late afternoon after the sun had worked its magic on an uncovered pile of fish, and you were rolling the dice between delicious dinner and unplanned fasting. No Michelin stars, just a gamble between tasty and tummy trouble. Street food wasn't limited to these staples. Honey cakes, fried in small portions, were sold as sweet treats during festivals and special occasions. Roasted chickpeas or nuts were also common, filling the role of the cheap, crunchy snack. Wine cellars offered watered-down wine by the cup, served from large jars to wash down whatever you'd just eaten. And then there were the more unusual offerings, bits of offal, organ meats, or experimental mixes of grain and vegetables. These weren't necessarily bad, but they were definitely the kinds of foods you'd buy if you were both hungry and brave. Street vendors themselves were part of the show. They shouted to advertise their goods, argued with customers over prices, and often sang or rhymed their sales pitches. Some became known for their particular cries, and Athenians would recognize them by sound alone. Picture walking through a crowded lane where the soundtrack is equal parts clattering sandals, braying donkeys, and a chorus of vendors yelling, "Hot bread, fresh figs, olives for your supper." It was less of a shopping trip and more of a sensory performance. The affordability of street food made it essential for those without time or resources to prepare meals at home. Day laborers, travelers, and poorer citizens depended on these quick bites to get through the day. For wealthier Athenians, street food might have been more of a guilty pleasure, a casual snack between proper meals at home. But regardless of class, everyone indulged from time to time. After all, it's hard to resist the smell of skewered fish sizzling over hot coals, no matter how big your estate is. There was also a social element. Grabbing food from a vendor wasn't just about eating, it was about being part of the crowd. People gathered around stalls, chatting while waiting their turn, sharing bites with friends or gossiping as they munched. In a city where public life thrived, street food stalls doubled as casual meeting points, the ancient equivalent of grabbing coffee with a friend. Still, the risks of street food were real. Hygiene wasn't exactly regulated, and the same streets that hosted vendors also hosted animals, mud, and waste. A dropped fig might be brushed off and sold anyway, and fish that had been sitting out too long might be roasted to disguise its age. Some vendors cared about quality, but many cared more about selling quickly. Buyers learned to be cautious, sticking to trusted sellers or gambling only when their hunger won out over their common sense. And yet, for all its unpredictability, street food was a vital part of Athenian life. It was the fuel of workers, the indulgence of children, the convenience of travelers, and the temptation of anyone with a few coins in their pouch. It embodied the city's character, lively, resourceful, and occasionally reckless. Eating on the streets wasn't just about filling your stomach. It was about participating in the messy, noisy, delicious rhythm of Athens itself. So if you'd walked through Athens hungry, you wouldn't have starved. You'd have had your choice of bread, olives, figs, grilled skewers, honey cakes, and more, each with its own risks and rewards. It wasn't refined dining, but it was fast, flavorful, and unforgettable. In short, street food, ancient Athenian style, cheap, cheerful, and only sometimes regrettable. If Athens' streets already sounded and smelled like chaos, the cast of characters wandering them made the spectacle complete. Walking down a busy lane meant stepping into a moving theatre where tragedy, comedy, and circus acts all played out simultaneously. On one corner, a beggar reached out with a trembling hand. On another, a slave hurried past with baskets piled high. Nearby, a performer balanced knives or played a flute for coins. It was a city where extremes rubbed shoulders, wealth and poverty, labor and leisure, solemn misery and sheer entertainment, all visible in the same crowded stretch of dirt road. Beggars were the most conspicuous. In a city that prided itself on democracy and freedom, there was no shortage of people who had fallen through the cracks. Some were elderly citizens unable to work, others were injured veterans, and still others were the chronically poor, dependent on scraps from the community. They stationed themselves at fountains, outside temples, or near the agora, where foot traffic was heavy. A beggar might hold out a bowl, cry out for mercy, or point to wounds and deformities as evidence of need. The most effective ones learned to craft their appeals almost like performances, reminding passers-by of their civic duty or the gods' displeasure toward those who ignored the needy. Yet generosity was always tempered with caution. Tip one beggar too openly, and suddenly you had a trail of outstretched hands behind you. Slaves, by contrast, weren't begging. They were working. They were everywhere, making up a massive portion of Athens' population, and their presence was woven into the fabric of daily life. Some carried heavy loads through the streets, water jars, baskets of grain, amphorae of wine. Others ran errands, delivering messages or purchases for their masters. A few belonged to merchants, manning stalls or tallying accounts, while more unfortunate ones trudged through the city under guard, destined for sale in the market. To the Athenian citizen, these figures were ordinary background, so common that their sheer numbers often went unremarked. But to an outsider, the sheer reliance on slave labor was unmistakable. And then there were the entertainers, the ones who injected spectacle into the streets. Jugglers tossed balls, knives, or flaming torches, assuming they weren't chased away for being a fire hazard. Musicians strummed lyres, blew flutes, or clattered percussion instruments, trying to draw an audience from the crowd. Storytellers spun tales of heroes and gods, embellishing them for laughs or suspense, while acrobats contorted themselves or balanced on their hands to win coins. Fortune-tellers set up shop on corners, promising glimpses of fate from bird flights, dice rolls or cryptic mumblings that always seemed to require a donation for proper interpretation. The variety was dazzling. A walk through the city could feel like stumbling into a festival, even on an ordinary day. Of course, performers needed payment to survive, which made their work precarious. Crowds might stop to watch a trick or listen to a song, but applause alone didn't buy bread. Coins were tossed onto mats or into cups, and competition was fierce. Entertainers developed strategies to hold attention, clever jokes, shocking stunts, or even guilt-tripping their audience into paying. Enjoyed the show? Pay up, or the gods might not smile on your harvest. It wasn't exactly subtle, but it worked often enough. And unlike beggars, performers offered something in return for coins, a service, however fleeting, making them more palatable to those who didn't want to feel exploited by endless appeals. The mingling of these groups, beggars, slaves, performers, created a uniquely Athenian street life, one that embodied the city's contradictions. Athens celebrated freedom, yet half the people visible in its streets had none. It prided itself on civic virtue, yet beggars constantly reminded everyone of poverty and inequality. It worshipped art and drama, yet some of its greatest performances took place not in grand theatres, but on dusty corners, where a juggler or a flute player earned survival one coin at a time. And for the casual pedestrian, this mix was impossible to ignore. You might pass a slave hauling a basket, step over a beggar's outstretched hand, and then stop to watch an acrobat twist into improbable shapes, all within the space of a single block. Each encounter pulled you into a different emotional register: pity, indifference, amusement, admiration, even annoyance. In a way, the streets were a mirror of Athens itself, brilliant and harsh, inspiring and exhausting, where high ideals coexisted with daily struggles. It's also worth noting that Athenians themselves sometimes blurred these categories. A citizen fallen on hard times could slide into begging. A slave skilled in music might entertain crowds in hopes of earning tips for his master, and some performers lived so precariously that they hovered one misstep away from poverty themselves. The boundaries weren't neat, and the city's energy came from that very instability. Everyone, in some way was performing. The beggar with his pleas, the slave with his labor, the juggler with his tricks, the politician with his speeches. For visitors, this street life could be overwhelming. Foreign merchants might marvel at the sheer density of human activity, while also recoiling from the sight of desperation. Philosophers sometimes commented on the chaos, using beggars as examples of misfortune or performers as illustrations of human vanity. But for Athenians, this wasn't spectacle, it was normal. The city thrived on the constant presence of extremes, the sense that every corner held another story. So if you found yourself on an Athenian sidewalk, you'd better keep your wits and your wallet about you. Tip the juggler, but don't drop a coin too carelessly near a beggar unless you want 10 more following you. Step aside for the slave with the water jar, unless you want an impromptu bath. And when a fortune teller offers you a glimpse of destiny, remember, the only certain prediction is that you'll be lighter in the purse when you walk away. If there was one thing Athenians loved more than olives, it was arguing. Politics wasn't confined to assemblies or council chambers. It spilled into the streets, the marketplaces, and even the steps of temples. You couldn't walk across town without stumbling into a debate, a speech, or at the very least a loud argument that had attracted an impromptu audience. Imagine every street corner doubling as a podcast recording studio, except there were no microphones, no editing, and no way to hit skip if you weren't interested. Athens was a democracy, and that meant every male citizen over 18 theoretically had a say in how the city was run. But unlike modern democracies, where you cast a ballot quietly in a booth, here participation was noisy, physical, and unavoidable. Speeches were delivered in open spaces, often to whoever happened to be standing nearby. A politician might climb onto a stone block or temple step, clear his throat, and launch into a passionate oration about taxes, military campaigns, or why his rival was clearly a moron unfit for office. Passers-by who had no intention of listening suddenly found themselves part of the audience, trapped in the gravitational pull of public rhetoric. And rhetoric was everything. To succeed in Athens, you needed words sharper than any spear. Skilled speakers studied the art of persuasion, practicing tone, gestures, and emotional appeals. They peppered their speeches with references to history, the gods, and the glory of Athens, all designed to stir the crowd. Some used humor, others thunderous outrage, but the goal was the same: win the listeners to your side. In a world without newspapers or campaign posters, the human voice was the most powerful weapon of politics. Street debates weren't just for the big names either. Ordinary citizens joined in, arguing passionately about policy, war, or whether so-and-so's new law would ruin everything. Friends gathered outside workshops to trade opinions while hammering out metal or stitching sandals. Even vendors in the agora might pause between sales to shout their thoughts about naval strategy. Politics was as omnipresent as dust in the air. Whether you liked it or not, it seeped into every conversation. What made this street-level politics remarkable was its performative quality. Every speech was both civic duty and theatre. Gestures mattered, hands raised dramatically, voices booming or quivering with emotion, pauses held just long enough to draw the crowd in. Audiences judged not only the logic of arguments but also the flair of delivery. A man with average ideas but great delivery might sway more votes than a genius who mumbled. The line between statesman and showman was thin, and some leaned heavily into spectacle. If you think modern politics feels like reality TV, ancient Athens had already perfected the format. The audience wasn't passive either. Crowds interrupted speeches with shouts, laughter, or jeers. They clapped when inspired, booed when bored, and heckled relentlessly if they suspected lies. The atmosphere was closer to a sporting event than a solemn assembly. Politicians had to think on their feet, deflecting hecklers with sharp comebacks or clever jokes. A speaker who lost the crowd's interest lost everything. Imagine trying to argue for a tax increase while someone in the back keeps yelling about your haircut. It wasn't easy, but it was the price of democracy. These constant debates shaped Athenian identity. Citizens saw themselves not just as subjects of a government but as active participants. Politics wasn't distant or abstract. It was lived daily in public through words. The sheer visibility of it reinforced a sense of belonging, even as it also revealed divisions. Street debates could become heated, sometimes spilling into insults or shoving matches. Yet, for all the chaos, Athenians believed this open contest of ideas was the essence of freedom. Of course, not everyone found this endless chatter appealing. Foreign visitors often remarked on the Athenians' obsession with politics, finding it exhausting. To outsiders, the streets seemed clogged with arguments over details that didn't matter. But to Athenians, those details were life itself. Decisions about alliances, taxes, or laws weren't just theoretical. They determined the survival of the city-state. In a world of constant threats from rival powers, the stakes were high, and every voice mattered, at least every citizen's voice. Performers and politicians often blurred together too. Some of the most skilled speakers also wrote plays, blending dramatic flair with political punch. Conversely, orators sometimes borrowed tricks from the theatre, using dramatic pauses or emotional appeals worthy of a tragic actor. Politics in Athens was quite literally theatre, staged in public, judged by the crowd, and remembered through performance. Yet the street theatre of politics also highlighted contradictions. Women, slaves, and foreigners, who made up the majority of Athens' population, had no voice in these debates. They watched from the sidelines, affected by decisions, but unable to influence them. So while the streets rang with the sound of democratic debate, those echoes didn't reach everyone. The performance was dazzling, but the cast list was limited. Still, for those who could participate, the political energy was intoxicating. To walk through Athens was to be immersed in a culture where words mattered, where persuasion was power, and where every street corner held the potential for a new argument. Some cities entertained themselves with gladiators, others with chariot races. Athens entertained itself with politics and made it a spectacle so vibrant that 2,000 years later, people are still talking about it. So the next time you complain about modern debates, remember Athens. At least you can mute the television. In Athens there was no mute button, only a flood of voices, each trying to outshout the other, turning the city into the noisiest podcast network history has ever known. If the speeches and debates turned Athens' streets into a living stage, the walls provided the city's permanent commentary section, while marble temples and stoas carried lofty inscriptions honoring gods and victories. The ordinary walls of shops and homes became the canvas for everyday Athenians to leave their mark, sometimes literally. Graffiti and public notices were as much a part of the urban landscape as dust and donkeys. Together they gave the city a running stream of announcements, arguments, jokes, and doodles, like a never-ending bulletin board for the entire population. Ancient Yelp reviews, carved right into the plaster. Graffiti in Athens was usually scratched or painted onto plastered walls. Some of it was simple, a name, initials, or a short boast. Imagine an Athenian teenager carving "Nicias was here" into the corner of a wall. Others left short poems or one-line jokes. Political slogans occasionally appeared too. Supporters of a candidate might scratch his name into walls around the agora, hoping to remind passers-by of his greatness, or at least his persistence. Opponents, naturally, retaliated with their own messages, sometimes mocking rivals with crude sketches. It was democracy not only in speech but in scribble. And oh, the doodles. Some were surprisingly artistic. Sketches of ships, horses, or even crude portraits of well-known figures. Others were what you might politely call rude drawings, proving that even in a city of philosophers, people still found time to immortalize body parts on walls. If you thought bathroom stall humor was a modern invention, Athens beat us to it by more than 2 millennia. Somewhere between solemn oaths of civic pride, you might stumble across a drawing that reminded you humans have always had a talent for immaturity. Alongside graffiti were more formal public notices. Athens lacked newspapers, so the walls became prime real estate for announcements. Officials posted decrees on stone slabs or plastered surfaces, often using whitewashed wooden boards as a temporary medium. Court summons, trial results, new laws, and festival announcements all appeared in public view. If you wanted to know what the assembly had decided yesterday, you didn't check your phone, you checked the nearest wall. Merchants also took advantage of this system. Lost and found notes were not uncommon. Lost, one sandal near the fountain, reward offered. A craftsman might advertise his services by inscribing or posting a small notice. Farmers announced when they had surplus grain or olive oil for sale. These notices were practical and direct, aimed at anyone who happened to be passing by. A stroll through the city was part shopping trip, part news scroll. The walls also acted as unofficial review boards. Dissatisfied with a baker, someone might scratch a warning onto a nearby wall. His bread is hard as stone. Impressed by a wine cellar, a cheerful inscription might praise the vintage. This was word of mouth carved into the city itself. While Athenians had no star rating system, the principle was the same, except you couldn't delete a bad review once someone had chiseled it in. Children, too, left their marks. Their graffiti showed up as playful drawings of animals, stick figures, or even mock battle scenes. For them, a city wall was the closest thing to a notebook. Some of these scratches still survive today, faint reminders that in between the speeches of statesmen and the decrees of officials, kids were busy doodling ships with oversized sails. It gives Athens' walls a strangely relatable quality. What child hasn't felt the urge to draw where they shouldn't? Naturally, not everyone approved. Property owners sometimes grew annoyed at their walls being covered in scratches and scribbles. Whitewashing over graffiti was a common tactic, though the persistence of writers meant fresh marks appeared soon after. It was a constant battle between those who wanted clean walls and those determined to leave a message. In this sense, Athens wasn't so different from modern cities where graffiti artists and city cleaners are locked in an endless cycle of paint and repaint. Graffiti and notices also revealed the blending of high and low culture. On one wall you might find a formal decree in carefully painted letters. Right beside it, someone had scratched a crude joke about a politician. Sacred text could share space with a doodle of a goat. Public announcements about an important trial might be flanked by a drawing of a ship sailing straight into absurdity. It was messy, but it was also democratic in the truest sense. Everyone had access to the wall, whether they were an official or an anonymous prankster. The effect was a city alive with written chatter. The walls spoke with many voices, solemn, comic, desperate, and rude. To walk through Athens was to read the pulse of the people, not just through speeches and debates, but through the scratched, painted, and posted words that covered the plaster. The streets might have been noisy, but the walls were just as talkative. In many ways, these inscriptions reflected the city itself, proud, chaotic, funny, and unfiltered. The agora may have been where politics played out on a grand stage, but the walls were where ordinary Athenians chimed in with their own running commentary. Graffiti didn't just decorate the city, it captured its personality. So if you'd wandered through Athens with your eyes open, you wouldn't just see temples and markets, you'd see the city's sense of humor, its frustrations, its arguments, and its playfulness etched into every corner. Some messages faded quickly, others lasted for years, but together they created an ongoing dialogue carved into stone. And if you didn't like what you saw on the wall, well, just grab a stylus and add your own. After all, the plaster wasn't picky about who got the last word. Close your eyes and try to imagine ancient Athens. If you picture calm philosophers quietly pondering beneath olive trees, erase that immediately. The Athens of reality was loud, deafeningly loud. From dawn until dusk, the city was a constant symphony of clanging tools, shouting merchants, braying donkeys, and shrieking children. Silence was rare enough to feel like a miracle, and peace and quiet weren't concepts most Athenians could even aspire to. In short, if you wanted tranquility, Athens was the last place to find it. Noise-cancelling headphones hadn't been invented. Yelling louder was the only solution. The day began early, and so did the noise. As the sun rose, blacksmiths hammered away in their workshops, the metallic clang echoing down narrow streets. Potters slapped clay on their wheels, the rhythmic thump-thump adding its beat. Carpenters sawed planks of wood, creating a rasping soundtrack that carried through open windows. Each craft had its own sound, and together they created a medley that was less harmonious orchestra and more chaotic jam session. The streets themselves amplified the noise, their close walls bouncing every shout and clang straight into your ears. But artisans weren't the only culprits. Merchants filled the air with constant cries, each trying to outshout the others. Fishmongers sang about the freshness of their catch. Fruit sellers waved figs in the air while proclaiming their sweetness, and bread vendors shouted about loaves still warm from the oven. The agora was particularly overwhelming, with dozens of voices overlapping into a kind of verbal brawl. To walk through the marketplace was to be bombarded by slogans, sales pitches and pleas. It wasn't enough to simply sell, you had to yell, and louder than your neighbor if you wanted to be heard. And then there were the animals. Donkeys were the most notorious offenders, their brays splitting the air like horns announcing the world's least welcome parade. Oxen bellowed as they hauled carts, goats bleated, chickens squawked, and dogs barked at everything and nothing. Animals were essential to the functioning of Athens, but they also ensured that no street stayed quiet for long. Add to that the occasional runaway pig squealing through a neighborhood, and you had a soundscape that could drive even the calmest philosopher to distraction. Children contributed their share as well. Kids played games in the streets, rolling hoops, shouting dares and laughing at each other's tumbles. Their joy was infectious, but their volume was undeniable. On top of play, children often ran errands for their families, darting between stalls while shouting to one another across the crowd. For parents, the noise was background. For anyone nursing a headache, it was punishment. Religious life added its own notes. Festivals meant processions with music, chanting, and the steady thump of drums. Shrines filled the air with priests calling prayers, punctuated by the cries of animals about to be sacrificed. Incense burners crackled, firewood popped, and crowds shouted in unison. Athens loved its festivals, but each one turned the city's volume up to maximum, leaving little chance of escape. Even political life added to the din. Orators declaimed in the agora, voices raised to carry over the clamor of merchants and animals. Crowds heckled, applauded, or shouted down speakers, turning every debate into a shouting match. Philosophy, too, wasn't as quiet as one might expect. Socrates and his followers debated loudly in public spaces, their conversations less hushed salon and more outdoor argument. Every corner had someone raising their voice about justice, truth, or why their rivals' ideas were absolute nonsense. At night, the sounds didn't entirely vanish. Taverns buzzed with laughter, music and drunken shouting. Dice players rattled their cubes across makeshift tables, celebrating wins or groaning over losses. Watchmen patrolled, calling out warnings or barking orders. Even the relative quiet of midnight could be broken by a dogfight, a late-night reveller stumbling home, or the creak of carts arriving before dawn. Sleep in Athens required either an ability to tune out chaos or a willingness to stuff your ears with wool. To visitors, the noise could be overwhelming. Travelers from quieter villages might find themselves exhausted after a day in the city, retreating to inns on the outskirts just for relief. But Athenians were so used to the clamor that it became invisible. Silence wasn't expected, so no one longed for it. The din of daily life was simply the background to existence, so natural that Athenians probably noticed quiet more than they noticed noise. The soundscape also served as a kind of civic identity. The chaos of hammering, shouting, and braying symbolized the energy of Athens itself. It was a city always in motion, always producing, always debating. The noise wasn't just distraction, it was proof of vitality. Every clang and cry echoed the fact that Athens was alive and thriving, bursting at the seams with people, work, and ideas. Still, for all the charm of this interpretation, it's hard not to imagine moments of frustration. You're trying to think through a complex problem, and outside your window, a donkey won't stop braying. You're hoping for a nap, but your neighbor is hammering away at a new door. You're craving just a moment of peace, but the marketplace down the street is holding what feels like a shouting competition. Athens might have been glorious, but it wasn't restful. So the next time you sigh about city noise, sirens, traffic, endless construction, Remember that Athenians had it worse. At least modern cities give you the option of earplugs. In Athens, the only solution was to raise your own voice and join the chorus. If you thought the daily noise of Athens was overwhelming, you haven't seen the city during a festival. On ordinary days, the streets were chaotic. During a celebration, they became nearly unrecognizable. Religious processions thundered through the avenues. Musicians blasted away on flutes and drums, and wine flowed as freely as water at the fountains. The result, half the city was drunk, and the other half was stuck in traffic, caused by the first half. Athenians loved a good festival. In fact, they had so many that you'd struggle to find a month without one. Each was tied to the gods, but while the rituals carried religious weight, the atmosphere was as much about communal revelry as sacred devotion. Festivals turned the city into a stage, with streets doubling as parade routes, dining halls, and theatres all at once. Even those who weren't particularly pious joined in, because in Athens, a festival was an excuse for food, wine, and fun on a massive scale. The grandest spectacles were processions. Picture it, a line of citizens stretching down the main roads, carrying offerings, garlands, and statues of the gods. Priests led the way, chanting prayers, while young girls in white robes carried sacred baskets. Musicians marched alongside, playing pipes, lyres, and drums in a rhythmic din that echoed off the walls. Behind them came the rest of the crowd, citizens, metics, slaves, jostling for position, some solemn, others already tipsy from pre-festival drinking. Processions clogged the streets for hours, bringing all traffic to a standstill. If you had an errand to run, too bad, you were either swept into the crowd or forced to wait it out while your neighbor waved incense in your face. The festivals tied to Dionysus, god of wine and theater, were particularly rowdy. The city Dionysia turned Athens into a multi-day extravaganza of plays, drinking, and public revelry. While the main performances happened in the theater, the celebrations spilled into the streets. Wine sellers poured cups for the crowds. Groups of revelers sang bawdy songs, and people staggered through the city arm in arm, praising Dionysus with slurred devotion. It was part religious rite, part street party, and all chaos. For sober Athenians trying to navigate the city, it meant dodging clusters of inebriated worshippers blocking entire alleys. Food was another major feature of festivals. Street vendors multiplied, hawking treats like honey cakes, roasted nuts, and fresh fruit to fuel the revelry. Families set up makeshift feasts in courtyards or even on the roadside, sharing bread and wine with neighbors and strangers alike. The usual hustle of the agora spilled outward, as stalls expanded into surrounding streets. The result was less orderly dining, and more everyone eat wherever you can stand. For some, this meant an impromptu picnic. For others, it meant fighting your way through a crowd of sticky-fingered children waving honey cakes like trophies. Music and dancing filled every corner. Groups of revelers spun in circles, clapping and stomping to the beat of drums. Choruses sang hymns to the gods, their voices booming across the city. Some of it was solemn, some celebratory, and some descended into the ancient equivalent of karaoke after too much wine. Drunken dancing, while not dignified, was a festival staple. If the gods demanded joy, Athenians delivered, often off-key and out of step. What made these festivals remarkable was how they transformed the city's identity. Athens, usually divided into citizens, foreigners, slaves, and women with different roles and restrictions, suddenly became a collective body. Everyone participated, even if unequally. Slaves might carry supplies or clean up after processions, women might prepare ritual offerings, and children might perform in choruses. While citizenship remained exclusive, festivals blurred the lines for a moment, creating the sense of a shared citywide celebration. But make no mistake, the sheer density of bodies made moving through Athens a nightmare. Crowds pressed shoulder to shoulder, streets clogged with celebrants, and animals decorated for processions blocked the way. Carts stood abandoned as their drivers gave up trying to push through. For those who enjoyed the spectacle, it was exhilarating. For those trying to get anywhere, it was maddening. Traffic jams weren't a modern invention. They just looked different in Athens, with goats wearing garlands instead of cars honking horns. Of course, festivals weren't only fun and games, they were deeply tied to the city's religious and political identity. Honoring the gods was seen as essential to civic well-being. A successful festival meant favor from Olympus, protection in war, and prosperity for the city. Participating was both a duty and a privilege, which gave the parties a seriousness underneath the laughter. Even drunken revelry had a sacred edge, framed as devotion to Dionysus, or whichever god was being honored. It was, in essence, joy turned into worship. Still, the average Athenian probably experienced festivals less as solemn ritual, and more as the highlight of their social calendar. It was a chance to see friends, show off new clothes, eat well, drink plenty, and escape the grind of daily chores. Festivals were Athens at its most theatrical, the city as a giant stage, the people as performers, and the gods as the ultimate audience. So if you picture Athens on a festival day, don't imagine quiet prayers and neatly lined parades. Imagine flutes screeching, drums pounding, revelers singing off-key, priests waving incense, vendors shouting about honey cakes, and a half-dozen tipsy citizens blocking your street as they stumble arm in arm. Half the city was drunk, and the other half was stuck in traffic caused by the first half. That was festival life in Athens, sacred chaos at its finest. For all of Athens' grand ideals about justice and democracy, daily life on its streets was far from orderly. City guards patrolled, laws were written on stone and courts bustled with trials, but crime and mischief still thrived in the gaps. Pickpockets prowled crowded markets, swindlers tricked the unwary, and street brawls erupted with a frequency that suggested Athenians enjoyed a good scuffle almost as much as they enjoyed a good debate. Athens may have given the world the concept of law, but its streets reminded everyone that theory and practice rarely walk hand in hand. The city did have enforcers, but they weren't the kind of police force we might picture today. Athens employed Scythian archers, foreign slaves acting as public guards. They patrolled festivals, markets, and assemblies to keep crowds in line, more recognizable by their distinctive outfits and bows than by any aura of authority. Their job was less about crime prevention and more about crowd control. If an assembly got rowdy, they were there to push people back into order. If a fight broke out in the agora, they waded in to separate combatants, but patrolling every alley, catching every thief, or foiling every scam, that was a little too much to expect. Pickpockets found Athens fertile ground, crowded streets and bustling festivals gave them ample opportunities. A skilled thief could slip a coin pouch from a distracted merchant, or lift a piece of jewelry from someone jostled in the crowd. Victims often didn't realize until much later, and by then the thief had vanished into the swirl of bodies. To make matters worse, Athenians carried money in small purses or loose in their cloaks, easy targets for nimble fingers. Some citizens learned to clutch their belongings tightly, but for many, losing a coin or two became just another hazard of street life. Swindlers were another menace. They sold watered-down wine, passed off spoiled fish as fresh, or shorted customers on weights and measures. The agora was as much a theatre of deception as of commerce. Officials known as agora nomoi were supposed to oversee fair trade, checking scales and punishing cheats, but enforcement was patchy. Clever merchants found ways to skirt the rules, and gullible buyers paid the price. Outsiders and foreigners were especially vulnerable, their unfamiliarity with the city making them easy marks for schemes. An overcharged visitor might complain, but the odds of justice being swift or effective were slim. And then there were the fights. Arguments could ignite anywhere, over a trade gone wrong, an insult shouted too loudly, or even a philosophical debate that got too heated. Once tempers flared, fists and sticks often replaced words. Brawls spilled into streets, drawing curious crowds who cheered, jeered, or tried half-heartedly to break things up. Sometimes guards intervened, but often bystanders let the combatants tire themselves out. For a city devoted to the art of persuasion, Athenians were surprisingly quick to let their knuckles do the talking. Petty crime was common, but serious crime, assault, theft of property, Even murder was handled by the courts. Athens had a famously elaborate legal system where citizens served as jurors, sometimes in panels numbering hundreds. Trials were public and theatrical, with speeches, witnesses, and appeals to civic pride. But these courts didn't prevent crime. They punished it after the fact. For ordinary Athenians, the immediate threat of being robbed or scammed wasn't much comforted by the knowledge that weeks later there might be a trial about it. Religious sanctuaries offered some protection. Temples were considered safe zones where violence and theft were taboo. Thieves caught stealing from a shrine could face harsh penalties, not just from the law but from divine wrath. Yet even sacred spaces weren't immune. Stories survive of desperate thieves stealing votive offerings left for the gods. In theory, the gods saw everything. In practice, not every offender was caught. Fear of crime shaped behavior. People traveled in groups at night, wary of wandering alone through dark alleys. Visitors often hired guides or escorts, not just to avoid getting lost, but to avoid getting mugged. Families warned children to avoid certain parts of town where disreputable characters gathered. Even in the glow of Athens' intellectual reputation, shadows lingered in its corners. But lawlessness also carried a strange charm for some. Street performers thrived in the same chaotic spaces where pickpockets worked. Arguments that turned into scuffles became stories retold at dinner tables, and the ever-present sense of risk added a raw energy to the city. Athens was not a sanitized place. It was gritty, unpredictable, and alive. You could lose your purse one moment and stumble into a brilliant philosophical conversation the next. Danger and brilliance coexisted, just as everywhere else in the city. The Athenians themselves were keenly aware of these contradictions. Comedies staged in theatres often poked fun at the crooked merchants, lazy guards, or pompous lawyers who filled the justice system. Ordinary people laughed because the caricatures rang true. Everyone knew the agora was full of cheats, that brawls erupted over nothing, and that guards couldn't be everywhere at once. Humor became a way of processing the constant tension between law and disorder. So while Athens prided itself on its legal innovations, life on the ground remained precarious. Laws were etched in stone, but pickpockets didn't read inscriptions. Guards patrolled, but fights still broke out. Justice was celebrated, but scams thrived. The city never fully reconciled its ideals with its reality, leaving its citizens to navigate a daily dance between order and chaos. In short, Athens' streets were policed but never tame, lawful but never law-abiding, regulated but rarely quiet. If democracy gave everyone a voice, crime made sure those voices also shouted in outrage, complaint or accusation. Law and disorder weren't opposites in Athens, they were neighbors, sharing the same street, and both very much alive. In Athens, religion wasn't something you saved for a temple visit on holy days. It was baked into every step of your daily walk. Shrines, little altars and offerings popped up on street corners, in courtyards, and even wedged into narrow alleys. The gods were everywhere, and so were the reminders to honor them. Forget parking meters. Watch out for mini-altars blocking the way. If you were strolling through Athens, odds were high that you'd stub your toe on a dedication to Hermes before you even made it to the market. These shrines came in all shapes and sizes. Some were grand and elaborately decorated, with columns and painted statues, while others were no more than a simple stone set up by a devout household. One of the most common sights was the Herm, a square stone pillar topped with the head of Hermes, often sporting a very noticeable earth fertility symbol carved in relief. These stood at crossroads and street corners, serving both as protective markers and as constant reminders that the gods were keeping an eye on you, literally and symbolically. Athenians passed them daily, sometimes pausing to touch them for luck or mutter a quick prayer before continuing on their way. Altars dedicated to other gods also dotted the cityscape. Tiny platforms piled with offerings to Apollo, Athena, or Dionysus could be found tucked between houses or standing proudly near fountains. These weren't hidden, private places of devotion. They were public markers, inserted directly into the flow of daily life. If you tripped over one, you didn't complain about clutter. You apologized to the gods and hoped they wouldn't smite you for your clumsiness. The streets of Athens were a spiritual obstacle course. Offerings littered these shrines, small bowls of grain, little cakes, fruit, or garlands of flowers. Sometimes coins were left, though risking theft was always a concern. Incense smoldered, adding yet another layer to Athens's already complex smellscape. Chickens or goats might be sacrificed at larger street altars, their blood staining the stones as priests performed rituals while passers-by looked on. Even the most mundane errand could suddenly intersect with a sacred moment. Imagine heading out to buy bread, only to have your path blocked by neighbors sacrificing a goat to Artemis right in front of you. That was daily life. Religion wasn't confined to shrines either. It animated the behavior of the people walking past. Omens mattered, a sneeze at the wrong moment, a bird flying overhead in the wrong direction, or a black dog crossing your path could derail someone's entire plan for the day. People stopped to interpret signs, adjusted routes to avoid bad luck, or muttered prayers under their breath. The streets of Athens weren't just physical spaces, they were cosmic battlegrounds where gods, spirits, and mortals all interacted. This omnipresence of religion also shaped politics and community. Public decrees and notices were often displayed near shrines, as if to borrow the gods' authority. Festivals transformed entire neighborhoods into sacred spaces, with temporary altars sprouting up and processions spilling through the streets. Even lawsuits and contracts sometimes invoked the gods, with oaths sworn at street corner shrines to lend weight to promises. The divine wasn't separate from civic life, it was its constant companion. Visitors to Athens often marveled at this saturation of devotion. Where other cities might concentrate their worship in a handful of temples, Athens seemed determined to give the gods prime real estate everywhere. A traveler might joke that you couldn't walk a block without running into Athena's watchful gaze or Hermes' stony smirk. But behind the humor was a real sense of reverence. Athenians believed their city thrived because the gods favored it, and constant offerings were the rent they paid for divine protection. Of course, not every shrine was treated with solemn respect. Children sometimes played around them, knocking over offerings or daring each other to touch sacred objects. Dogs and goats had no sense of reverence and happily snatched at food left for the gods. Accidents happened, and some poor soul inevitably had to explain why a goat had just eaten Apollo's fruit offering. In these moments, religion collided with the everyday in ways that were sometimes comic, sometimes tense, but always a reminder of how deeply it permeated the streets. There was also an undercurrent of fear. Failing to honor the gods properly could invite disaster, not just for the individual but for the whole community. Stories circulated of plagues, defeats, or strange mishaps blamed on neglected rituals or desecrated shrines. This kept people vigilant. Even the most skeptical citizen might toss a handful of grain onto a street altar just in case. After all, angering Athena wasn't a gamble anyone wanted to take. What's remarkable is how seamlessly religion blended with the practical. A shrine might serve as both a sacred space and a convenient landmark when giving directions. Turn left at the herm with the wreaths, then straight until you hit the altar of Artemis. The divine shaped the geography of Athens as much as hills or fountains did. For Athenians, the gods weren't distant beings hidden in lofty temples. They lived right there, woven into the cobblestones, commanding constant attention. So while Athens is remembered for its democracy, its art, and its philosophy, its streets told another story, one of relentless devotion. Shrines cluttered corners, offerings piled high, and prayers floated constantly into the air. The gods were everywhere, whether you wanted them or not. And if you tried to complain about tripping over yet another altar in your path, well, you could always take it up with Hermes, though good luck winning that argument. If you wandered through the streets of Athens, you'd quickly realize the city wasn't just made up of native-born citizens. Everywhere you turned there were foreigners, merchants, craftsmen, laborers, teachers, sailors, and more, woven into the fabric of the city's daily life. Athens called them metics, resident aliens, who weren't citizens but weren't temporary visitors either. They lived, worked, and paid taxes in the city, often for generations, creating a constant reminder that Athens was multicultural long before that became a buzzword. Gemetics came from across the Greek world and beyond. Some hailed from nearby city-states like Corinth or Thebes, others from distant places like Lydia, Thrace, or Egypt. They brought with them languages, accents, and customs that stood out in the chatter of Athenian streets. The soundscape of Athens was already noisy, but layer in the hum of multiple dialects, and you had a city that sounded like the Mediterranean squeezed into one bustling hub. A merchant shouting in Ioric Greek might be bargaining with a customer whose accent betrayed a Phoenician upbringing, while a Thracian slave overheard in the background tried to wrangle a stubborn donkey. These foreigners weren't lounging about, they were the engines of the economy. Metics often filled essential roles that Athenians themselves either couldn't or wouldn't take on. Many became traders, importing grain, timber, or exotic luxuries the city depended on. Others ran workshops producing pottery, armor, or textiles, employing both free workers and slaves. Some taught, especially in specialized fields like music or medicine, offering knowledge Athens couldn't generate on its own. Without metics, the city would have been poorer, not only in goods but also in skills. Athens liked to brag about its self-sufficiency, but in truth, it leaned heavily on the labor and expertise of outsiders. Despite their contributions, metics occupied a peculiar social space. They weren't slaves, they had freedom of movement, could own property with restrictions, and earned wages, but they weren't citizens either. They couldn't vote, hold political office, or own land in Attica without special permission. To remain in Athens legally, they had to register with a citizen sponsor and pay a special tax called the metoikon. It was like being invited to the party, asked to bring snacks but never being allowed near the dance floor. Still, many metics thrived. Some became wealthy merchants with thriving businesses, their names recognized across the city. A few even earned honorary citizenship through extraordinary service, though this was rare and tightly controlled. For the majority, life meant working hard, paying their dues, and carving out a space in a society that valued their labor but kept them at arm's length. The visibility of foreigners also added to the city's cultural flavor. Imagine walking through the agora and spotting a Phoenician trader selling dyed purple cloth, a Lydian hawking intricate jewelry, and an Egyptian displaying papyrus scrolls. Each stall wasn't just an economic exchange, it was a cultural encounter. Athenians could sample foreign goods, hear foreign music, or even adopt foreign fashions, much to the horror of traditionalists who grumbled about corrupting influences. Yet these influences seeped in anyway, enriching Athens and making its streets more colorful. But being a metic wasn't always easy. They were often the target of suspicion or scorn, particularly when politics turned sour. In times of crisis, say during war with another city-state, foreigners might suddenly find themselves viewed as potential spies or traitors. Some faced restrictions on where they could live or how they could conduct business. Laws were sometimes enforced unevenly, with metics bearing the brunt of penalties while citizens got away with slaps on the wrist. Athens needed foreigners, but it never fully trusted them. Religion provided both a bridge and a barrier. Many metics participated in Athenian festivals, worshipping the city's gods alongside citizens. At the same time, they brought their own deities and rituals, setting up small shrines that puzzled or intrigued Athenians. A Phoenician sailor might leave offerings to Melkart, while an Egyptian trader invoked Isis. To the average Athenian, this was exotic and sometimes unsettling, proof that Athens was part of a wider world, not just the center of it. Daily interactions, however, often smoothed over these differences. Athenians bought bread from foreign bakers, consulted Thracian nurses for medical care, and sent their children to learn music from foreign teachers. The city might not have officially embraced multiculturalism, but its people lived it every day through necessity. Athens thrived on the labor and creativity of outsiders, even while loudly insisting that true greatness belonged only to its citizens. The irony was hard to miss. The so-called birthplace of democracy depended heavily on those who had no political voice. The goods you bought, the clothes you wore, Even the very tools used in the assembly were often made or traded by foreigners who could never set foot inside that political body. Metics shaped the city while being barred from shaping its decisions, yet in their own way, metics left an enduring mark. Their presence reminded Athenians that their city wasn't an island, it was part of a vast, interconnected world. The diversity of Athens gave it resilience, creativity, and wealth, even if it also generated tensions. Without foreigners, Athens might have been a quieter, simpler place, but it certainly wouldn't have been the Athens we remember, vibrant, bustling, and plugged into the wider Mediterranean. So when you picture the streets of Athens, don't just imagine citizens in white chitons discussing democracy. Picture a Babylonian merchant haggling over copper prices, a Thracian craftsman hammering out a bronze shield, and an Egyptian sailor telling stories about the Nile. Athens wasn't just Greek, it was a crossroads of cultures, alive with voices from across the known world. And while the citizens congratulated themselves on being the pinnacle of civilization, the metics quietly kept the machine running, proving that even in antiquity, greatness was never achieved alone. If Athens dazzled the world with its marble temples and clever philosophers, it also reeked of a less glamorous truth. The city had a waste problem. For all their achievements in art, politics, and drama, Athenians hadn't quite cracked the code on urban sanitation. The streets themselves bore the brunt of the issue. Chamber pots were routinely emptied from upper windows, animals dropped their own generous gifts, and trash piled up in corners until someone took pity or profit on hauling it away. Sidewalk navigation, not that sidewalks actually existed, was basically a high-stakes video game, where losing meant stepping directly into something unpleasant. Let's start with the human side of things. Private houses didn't have plumbing. Instead, families relied on chamber pots, or simple latrines tucked into courtyards. When those filled up, waste had to go somewhere, and that somewhere was usually the nearest street or open drain. Picture it, you're strolling to the marketplace, the sun is shining, and suddenly a clay pot tips over from a second-story window, unleashing its contents directly into your path. If you were lucky, the splash just missed you. If you weren't, well, let's just say you'd be invoking every god you knew. Animals made things worse. Donkeys, goats, oxen, and dogs roamed freely through Athens, and not one of them had the courtesy to clean up after themselves. Droppings peppered the ground in markets, alleys, and courtyards, often blending seamlessly with mud or dust. Add in chickens scattering feathers and pigs rooting through scraps, and the result was a city where the streets were never ever clean. Shoes, when people wore them, didn't just protect against rough terrain, they were defense equipment against the biological minefield of urban life. Household garbage also joined the mix. Ashes from hearths, broken pottery, fish bones, spoiled food, all were tossed out into alleys or piled in pits near the edge of town. Scavengers sometimes picked through the piles for anything reusable, and pigs happily rooted in them for scraps, but much simply sat there, rotting under the Mediterranean sun. The smell was unavoidable, the flies omnipresent, and the risk of disease real, though ancient Athenians wouldn't have understood it in modern terms. To them, it was just part of city living. There were attempts at management. Some streets had rudimentary drains to channel waste and rainwater downhill, but these clogged easily, and maintenance wasn't consistent. Slaves and poorer laborers were occasionally employed to carry off trash, dumping it outside the city walls. But this was a temporary fix. Waste always returned, carried back in on sandals, carts, or the wind. No matter how much you scraped, swept, or cursed, filth was a permanent resident of Athens. Public spaces suffered most. The agora, packed with merchants and animals, quickly accumulated discarded food, broken containers, and whatever waste people didn't feel like carrying elsewhere. Festivals left behind mountains of trash, smashed cups, leftover food, even blood from sacrifices. Cleanup crews sometimes tackled the mess, but never fast enough to prevent the stench from lingering. Imagine holding a political debate while swatting flies away from yesterday's pile of spoiled figs that was daily reality. Water sources were not immune. Fountains supplied clean water for the city, but the runoff channels around them often filled with discarded scraps or sludge. Children splashed in puddles left by the overflow, dogs drank freely, and more than one careless passerby slipped on the slick stones. Religious shrines scattered across the city were supposed to inspire reverence, but even they weren't always safe. The base of an altar might accumulate ashes, wilted garlands, and a suspicious puddle from a nearby chamber pot, leaving worshippers to navigate devotion alongside disgust. Visitors to Athens sometimes marveled at the city's intellectual brilliance but recoiled at its filth. To those from smaller towns or cleaner rural settings, the capital's waste problem was shocking. How could a people capable of building the Parthenon also tolerate streets that doubled as open sewers? Athenians themselves seemed largely unfazed. They grew up with the smells, the mess, and the constant vigilance required to step carefully. It was simply the cost of living in a dense, thriving metropolis. Yet the problem wasn't without consequences. Disease outbreaks occasionally swept the city, and while Athenians blamed the gods or bad air, the reality was more mundane. Poor sanitation made everyone vulnerable. During the Peloponnesian War, when refugees crowded inside Athens' walls, the lack of proper waste disposal turned deadly, as overcrowding and filth helped spread plague. It was a grim reminder that even the most powerful city could be brought low by the things its people tried to ignore. On a daily basis, though, Athenians simply adapted. They learned to skirt puddles, dodge chamber pot dumps, and scold animals out of their way. Foot travel became an art of alertness, requiring a sharp eye and steady balance. Perhaps this constant vigilance was part of what kept Athenians sharp. Nothing hones your focus like trying to avoid stepping in donkey dung while carrying a jug of water. So, while we celebrate Athens for democracy, philosophy, and drama, its streets told a messier story. Waste was everywhere, falling from windows, piling in corners, squishing underfoot. It didn't stop Athenians from living, trading, debating, or celebrating, but it was always there, a reminder that brilliance and filth often coexisted in the same space. Athens sparkled from afar, but up close, it demanded that you watch your step. If you strolled through ancient Athens expecting grand boulevards and neatly ordered neighborhoods, disappointment was waiting just around the corner. And by corner I mean a sharp turn into a narrow, shadowy alley, barely wide enough for a donkey. The street architecture of Athens reflected its organic growth rather than any top-down design. Urban planning was less plan and more just squeeze it in there. Houses, workshops, and small shrines crowded together like a group photo where everyone's jostling for elbow room. The result was a city that felt more like a maze than a map. Most Athenian streets were narrow, twisting lanes that had evolved over time as buildings sprouted wherever space allowed. There was little thought to symmetry or grid layouts. Those belonged to later city planning experiments in other Greek colonies. Athens, by contrast, was a patchwork of winding routes. Some alleys were so tight that two carts couldn't pass without one backing up awkwardly, while others ended abruptly in courtyards or walls, forcing pedestrians to retrace their steps. Navigating the city felt like playing a game of chance, where every turn might lead you to the agora or to someone's chicken coop. Houses themselves reflected this improvisational growth. Most were modest, built from sun-dried mud brick on stone foundations. The exteriors were plain, often blending into one another without distinction. The interiors were organized around small courtyards, but from the street, all you saw was a solid wall interrupted by the occasional wooden door. For passers-by, this gave residential areas a monotonous fortress-like appearance. Wealthier homes might include second stories or tiled roofs, but even these rubbed shoulders with humbler dwellings. The jumble created neighborhoods that were dense, chaotic, and unpredictable. Workshops further crowded the streets. Potters, metalworkers, tanners, and carpenters often set up shop right along busy routes, their entrances opening directly onto the lanes. The constant noise of hammering and sawing spilled out into public space, while goods often overflowed into the street. A potter's jars might line the wall outside, leaving barely enough room for pedestrians to squeeze by. A carpenter could be seen planing wood just inches from passers-by. Space was so limited that public and private blurred, Your street view was half architecture, half open-air workshop. Public buildings were the exception, breaking up the dense sprawl with imposing presence. Stones, temples, and fountains stood out with their columns and decorative facades, reminding Athenians of civic pride and religious duty. But even these were woven into the haphazard web of lanes. You could step out of a cramped alley that smelled of fish and leather, and suddenly find yourself staring at the gleaming marble of a temple portico. The juxtaposition was jarring but uniquely Athenian, grandeur beside grit, sacred beside messy everyday life. Lighting, or rather the lack of it, made street architecture even trickier. During the day, sunlight poured into open spaces like the agora, but many alleys remained perpetually dim thanks to their narrowness and the overhanging upper floors of houses. At night, with no street lamps, the city plunged into darkness. Residents relied on torches or oil lamps which cast only a small pool of light. The architecture itself seemed to conspire against visibility, creating pockets of shadow where accidents or more sinister encounters could easily occur. Ventilation was another issue. With buildings pressed so close together, air circulation was poor in some districts. Heat built up in summer, and odors from workshops or waste piled up quickly. The streets didn't breathe so much as wheeze, yet Athenians seemed to adapt, tolerating the cramped quarters in exchange for the benefits of living close to neighbors, markets, and public life. Privacy wasn't a priority. Community and convenience took precedence, even if it meant hearing your neighbor's arguments through thin walls or smelling his fish stew wafting directly into your home. Street width also reinforced social dynamics. Main thoroughfares were wider, accommodating carts and crowds, while side alleys narrowed to spaces suited only for foot traffic. Wealthier districts might boast slightly broader lanes and sturdier construction, but even there the general aesthetic was more functional congestion than elegance. Poorer quarters, meanwhile, were cramped to the extreme, with houses practically leaning into one another and alleys so tight that two people passing might brush shoulders. The architecture reflected status, but it never escaped the city's overall sprawl. Despite the clutter, Athenians made it work. Neighbors chattered across narrow streets, children darted through alleys in play, and workshops drew customers from the foot traffic constantly pressed close to their doors. The city's architecture wasn't designed to impress visitors with symmetry or order. It was built to serve the immediate needs of its people. Every corner was filled, every scrap of land pressed into use. It may have looked chaotic, but it thrived because it was lived in. For visitors, however, the experience could be overwhelming. Foreigners accustomed to cities laid out on cleaner grids found Athens baffling. Directions were nearly useless without local landmarks, and the claustrophobic streets could feel oppressive. Yet for Athenians, this was home, a labyrinth of mud brick and marble, disorderly but alive. The architecture wasn't beautiful in the conventional sense, but it embodied the very spirit of the city, practical, bustling, and constantly reshaped by its inhabitants. So when we picture Athens, it's tempting to imagine only the shining temples on the Acropolis. But most Athenians didn't live among marble colonnades. They lived in crowded houses, navigated twisting alleys, and brushed shoulders with craftsmen at work in their shop fronts. The city's true architecture wasn't its monuments. It was the lived-in mess of its streets. Urban planning may have been more afterthought than master plan, but that messy sprawl carried the heartbeat of Athens. If you want to know what ancient Athens sounded like after you filtered out the hammering workshops and braying donkeys, just listen for the children. They were everywhere. The streets doubled as playgrounds, and kids made use of whatever space and whatever objects they could find. Hoops rolled, dolls were clutched, knucklebones rattled on stone, and laughter ricocheted off the walls of narrow alleys. Playground safety standards? None. Survival rate? Frankly impressive. Children weren't confined indoors. Most Athenian homes were modest, with cramped courtyards and little room for extended play, so kids spilled into the streets, turning every lane, corner, and open patch of ground into an impromptu play zone. Their games were noisy, physical, and often chaotic. Rolling hoops, for instance, was wildly popular. A boy or girl would push a wooden or metal hoop along with a stick, racing to keep it upright while weaving through carts, animals, and neighbors who weren't thrilled about being smacked in the shin. Think of it as the ancient version of kids on scooters zooming across busy sidewalks. Girls often played with dolls, sometimes simple wooden figures, sometimes clay versions with jointed limbs. These dolls weren't just toys, they taught future roles. Athenian girls might practice dressing them, arranging miniature households, or even offering them later to gods like Artemis when they reached marriageable age. To the children, though, they were companions, carried through the streets while their owners shouted at brothers, dodged dogs, and demanded space among the bustle. Knucklebones were another staple, essentially the ancient precursor to dice games or jacks. Kids tossed and caught them, competing in skill-based games that involved complex throws and catches. The clatter of knucklebones on stone streets became part of Athens' soundtrack, punctuated by triumphant cries from winners and groans from sore losers. Sometimes these games had stakes, small tokens, food, or bragging rights that lasted until the next round. And since gambling was practically a Greek pastime, even children practiced their own miniature versions of risk and reward. Running games and mock battles also filled the streets. Children chased each other in circles, invented war scenarios with sticks as swords, or played elaborate tag-like games that tested both speed and cunning. Alleyways became fortresses, doorways turned into bases, and anyone unlucky enough to pass through mid-game risked being conscripted into play. The streets, dangerous as they were, gave children freedom that houses couldn't. Dodging carts, animals, and chamber pot dumps was part of the challenge. For the most part, they survived, and learned agility along the way. Not all street activity was pure play. Children were also errand runners, sent by parents to fetch bread, carry messages, or haul small jugs of water. These tasks gave them purpose, but also blended seamlessly with play. A child dispatched to buy figs might dawdle, trading jokes with friends or sneaking in a quick game of knucklebones before heading home. Parents knew, but errands doubled as a way to keep children busy outside cramped houses, so tolerating a little mischief was part of the deal. Street performances often attracted children too. Jugglers, flute players, or storytellers would gather crowds, and kids were always front and center, wide-eyed and eager. Beggars sometimes coaxed coins from sympathetic children, while vendors tempted them with cheap sweets like honey cakes or nuts. Parents may have grumbled, but the streets provided more entertainment for free than any household could contain. In this way, Athens raised its children not just in private but in public, with the city itself acting as their extended playground and classroom. Danger, of course, lurked in every corner. Carts barreled through alleys, pulled by donkeys indifferent to small bodies in their path. Open drains collected waste, which made for slippery footing at best and disease risk at worst. Fights broke out, and children sometimes got caught in the crossfire of adult tempers. Yet these dangers weren't enough to stop play. They were simply part of the background, and children learned quickly to adapt. Their survival wasn't guaranteed, but those who grew up dodging carts and slipping past angry dogs likely developed reflexes sharp enough to rival any soldiers. Children also absorbed the city's rhythms by living so publicly. They heard political arguments shouted in the agora, listened to gossip traded at fountains, and watched processions sweep by with pomp and incense. They weren't always active participants, but the exposure shaped them. By the time Athenian boys were old enough to enter formal education, they already understood the city's pulse, the noise, the arguments, the humor, and the dangers. For girls whose lives would later be more confined to domestic roles, childhood offered the most freedom they would ever experience, and the streets were their stage. Visitors might have found Athenian children unruly, loud, messy, constantly underfoot, but to Athenians their presence was a reminder of continuity, of the city's resilience. Every hoop rolling down a street, every clattering knucklebone was proof that life thrived amid the dust, noise, and chaos. And while no one kept statistics, the very fact that so many survived their rough-and-tumble play speaks volumes about both the toughness of Athenian kids and the adaptability of their parents. So if you picture Athens streets, Don't imagine them only as venues for trade and debate. Picture children darting between donkeys, shrieking with laughter as they chase hoops, or squatting in a circle tossing knucklebones with practiced skill. The city wasn't just for grown-ups. It was a playground too, messy, risky, and endlessly alive. And for the kids of Athens, those streets were their training ground for the unpredictable, chaotic, and vibrant world they were destined to inherit. If you thought the Athenians themselves made the streets chaotic, wait until you add in the four-legged and sometimes feathered population. Donkeys, dogs, goats, chickens, and even the occasional pig wandered through Athens freely, blurring the line between domestic companion and public menace. The city wasn't simply home to humans, it was basically a petting zoo without fences or supervision. Donkeys were the true workhorses of Athenian life, though technically they weren't horses at all. These sturdy creatures hauled everything from firewood to amphorae of wine, trudging through the narrow lanes with expressions of eternal exhaustion. They were indispensable for trade and transport, but they had a stubborn streak that could bring entire streets to a halt. A donkey deciding it was done for the day might plant itself squarely in the middle of an alley, refusing to move no matter how much its owner tugged, kicked, or pleaded. The result? An impromptu traffic jam of carts, pedestrians, and frustrated neighbors who muttered that Dionysus himself must have possessed the beast. Dogs were everywhere too, forming a kind of unofficial canine citizenry. Some were guard dogs tied up in courtyards, others half-feral wanderers that roamed in packs. They scavenged food scraps, barked at strangers, and occasionally adopted neighborhoods as their own. Children grew up alongside them, sometimes befriending them, sometimes fleeing when a dog decided to give chase. Rabies was a known risk, but Athenians still valued dogs for their loyalty and protection. They were both companions and hazards, part of the city's living soundtrack with their constant barking. Goats brought their own brand of chaos. Kept for milk, meat, and sometimes sacrifice, they were notorious escape artists. If a gate was left ajar, goats would happily wander into the streets, nibbling on anything vaguely edible. Laundry left to dry, garlands meant for a shrine, or even scrolls carried by unlucky students. Their bleating added another layer to the city's symphony of noise, and their droppings ensured that the streets were never truly clean. Yet Athenians tolerated them, partly because goats were valuable, and partly because chasing one down an alley was just another part of daily life. And then there were the chickens. They scuttled underfoot, pecking at grain scattered in the dirt or fluttering in protest when children tried to grab them. They were cheap, plentiful, and practical, providing both eggs and meat, but their habit of darting suddenly across streets made them as dangerous to pedestrians as modern traffic. Trip over a chicken, and you risked dropping your bread, your jug, or your dignity. Chickens might have been the smallest of Athens' street animals, but they were no less a part of the city's everyday chaos. Animals weren't confined to private ownership either, they spilled into public life. The agora buzzed not just with merchants and buyers, but also with braying donkeys and clucking chickens. Fountains became watering holes for dogs and goats alongside the humans. Festivals incorporated animals into processions and sacrifices, adding bleats, brays, and squeals to the already deafening mix of flutes and drums. Even temples had their fair share of animal visitors, sometimes intentional offerings, sometimes curious strays sniffing around for leftovers. The lack of fences or designated enclosures meant animals lived right alongside people, with few boundaries. They darted in and out of homes, mingled with children's games, and occasionally invaded meals. A family eating dinner in a courtyard might suddenly find a dog nosing its way toward the bread basket. A chicken might hop onto a window ledge, squawking loudly enough to interrupt a philosophical discussion. Animals were so woven into the fabric of the city that their presence barely raised eyebrows unless they caused outright damage. Yet animals weren't just background, they shaped how Athenians moved through their city. Navigating streets meant dodging more than carts and puddles. It meant stepping around tethered oxen, sidestepping donkeys, or shooing chickens out of the way. Children learned early how to read animal behavior. knowing when to give a dog wide berth or when to sprint ahead of a goat that looked ready to charge. Adults, too, developed a kind of animal radar, scanning alleys for obstacles that could moo, bray, or bite. Religious and cultural symbolism added another dimension. Certain animals carried associations that made their presence meaningful. Dogs were linked to Hecate and protection, goats to Dionysus and fertility, chickens to omens used in divination. Seeing animals in the streets wasn't just practical. It could be interpreted as a sign from the gods, depending on the circumstance. A rooster crowing at dawn might be ordinary, or it might spark someone to mutter about divine timing. Athens wasn't just a zoo, it was a zoo infused with cosmic significance. Of course, not everyone loved the constant animal presence. Complaints surely echoed through neighborhoods when goats chewed on clothing, dogs barked all night, or donkeys blocked alleyways. But the city had no choice. Animals were indispensable to its economy, food supply, and daily functioning. The inconvenience was tolerated because without them, Athens wouldn't run at all. For outsiders, the combination of animals and people might have seemed chaotic, even primitive, but for Athenians it was simply the rhythm of life. Animals weren't tucked neatly away, they lived in the same spaces, contributed to the same din, and created the same mess. The city wasn't designed to separate species, it was designed to cram them all together and hope for the best. So if you imagine Athens' streets, don't picture them as purely human arenas of debate and commerce. Picture donkeys braying stubbornly in the middle of an alley, dogs barking at shadows, goats chewing on anything not nailed down, and chickens scattering underfoot. It wasn't orderly, it wasn't clean, and it definitely wasn't quiet. But it was Athens, lively, unpredictable, and shared with creatures as much a part of the city as the people themselves. If Athens had courts filled with jurors and carefully scripted speeches, it also had a much cheaper and faster legal system, yelling at your opponent in the street until one of you either gave up or stormed off. Street justice was a daily performance, and Athenians were masters of it. Court was time-consuming and expensive. Why spend days preparing speeches when you could just throw insults or fists in front of an impromptu audience? Arguments could ignite anywhere. Maybe two merchants in the agora accused each other of cheating with rigged scales. Maybe neighbors quarreled over where one house ended and the other began. Maybe someone's goat had wandered into another man's garden and chewed up the herbs. These disputes didn't always wait for the solemnity of judges and jurors, they exploded on the spot. Passers-by became the jury, gawking, laughing, or egging on the combatants. In a city obsessed with public life, even private grudges became public theatre. Insults were the first line of defense. Athenians had an entire vocabulary of verbal weapons, honed through both comedy and politics. An offended citizen could unleash a string of mockery that attacked not only his opponent's honesty, but also his family, his looks, and possibly his table manners. The Greeks believed words carried real power, and in the heat of the street they were often sharper than swords. If you think modern Twitter clapbacks are brutal, ancient Athens had already mastered the art of the savage put-down. If insults didn't settle the matter, fists sometimes did. Street brawls were common enough that most Athenians weren't shocked by the sight of two men grappling in the dirt, surrounded by cheering spectators. Fights could break out in marketplaces, outside taverns, or even near temples, if tempers ran hot enough. A shove over a spilled jug of wine could escalate into a wrestling match, with each man determined to prove not only his strength but also his honor. Physical justice was messy, noisy, and occasionally bloody, but it was also swift and cheaper than hiring a lawyer. Crowds played a huge role in these spectacles. Athenians loved an audience, and disputes attracted one quickly. Once enough people gathered, the argument took on the tone of a performance. Combatants shouted louder, gestured grander, and played to the reactions of bystanders. Sometimes the crowd intervened, breaking up fights or mocking the loser into retreat. Other times they simply enjoyed the show, treating it like a free form of street entertainment. Disputes became part courtroom, part comedy club, part wrestling match. Women rarely took part directly, but they were not silent observers. Market women were known for sharp tongues, and they could cut down a man's pride with a single scathing remark. Children, too, chimed in, heckling from the sidelines or imitating the fighters afterward in their own play. Street justice wasn't confined to the disputants. It was a community event, shaping reputations and reinforcing social expectations. A man who consistently lost public quarrels risked becoming a neighborhood punchline. That said, Athenians weren't lawless. The formal courts loomed in the background, ready to take over if disputes got too large to ignore. Serious crimes like assault with weapons, theft, or fraud often ended up before jurors, but street-level clashes were a pressure valve, letting off steam before matters escalated that far. Most quarrels didn't need judges, they needed volume, a few bruises, and the satisfaction of having won in the eyes of one's peers. Interestingly, this rough-and-ready form of justice mirrored Athenian democracy itself. The city valued participation, debate, and the ability to persuade. In court, persuasion came through long speeches. In the street, persuasion came through insults, posture, and the crowd's laughter. Both were contests of words and performance, just on different scales. Athens was a society where public opinion mattered enormously, and whether you were a politician or a fishmonger, your standing could rise or fall based on how you handled conflict in full view of your neighbors. Of course, not every dispute was noble. Scammers sometimes staged fake quarrels to distract crowds while accomplices picked pockets. Others shouted loudly about an opponent's supposed crimes, knowing that the stink of rumor would linger whether or not it was true. Street justice could be manipulated, and reputations could be shredded in minutes. There was no appeals process. Once the crowd laughed at you, your social credit took a hit that was hard to repair. For all its chaos, Athenians saw street disputes as part of life, not as signs of decay. They were proof that the city was alive, that its people cared fiercely about honor, fairness, and being heard. The agora wasn't just a marketplace for goods, it was a marketplace for reputation. Every quarrel became another lesson in who was strong, who was clever, and who wasn't worth taking seriously. So if you picture Athens' streets, don't just imagine dignified philosophers and pious worshippers. Picture two men screaming about the price of figs, a circle of onlookers howling with laughter, and one poor donkey stuck in the middle looking deeply unimpressed. For Athenians, justice wasn't only carved into stone laws, it was also hammered out in the dust, one insult and one shove at a time. For the Athenians, getting from one end of the city to the other was never a simple stroll. There were no cars, no buses, no trams, just feet, carts, and the occasional horse. But don't let the simplicity fool you. The daily commute in Athens could be just as frustrating as any modern rush hour. A traffic jam didn't mean bumper-to-bumper cars honking their horns. It meant your donkey stopped in the middle of a crowded lane to eat someone else's figs, and now an entire procession of merchants, children, and goats were glaring at you. Walking was the primary mode of transport, and the city was built for it, or perhaps more accurately, resigned to it. Most Athenians traveled everywhere on foot, whether they were citizens heading to the assembly, slaves running errands, or women carrying water jars from fountains. The twisting, narrow lanes discouraged anything larger than a handcart. Your sandals became your most reliable vehicle, and your own stamina the only fuel. Long commutes weren't unusual. Someone living on the outskirts of the city might trudge for an hour or more just to reach the agora, dodging mud puddles, livestock, and chamber pot surprises along the way. Carts, when used, created their own kind of chaos. Two-wheeled and pulled by donkeys or oxen, they were essential for hauling goods, amphorae of wine, sacks of grain, or piles of firewood, but their size and slow pace turned narrow streets into bottlenecks. If a cart stopped to unload or a donkey refused to move, traffic ground to a halt. With no sidewalks to separate pedestrians, everyone behind was forced to wait or squeeze past at risk of a bruised hip. And remember, animals don't follow traffic laws. A donkey might veer suddenly toward a stall of vegetables, creating a domino effect of shouting vendors and spilled produce. Horses were rarer, reserved for the wealthy. They were expensive to feed and maintain, so only aristocrats or cavalrymen rode through the city. Their presence was both impressive and intimidating. Nothing parted a crowd faster than a citizen on horseback clopping down a narrow street. But horses were also skittish, easily spooked by noise or sudden movement. A goat darting out of an alley could send a horse rearing, turning a morning commute into an impromptu rodeo. For most Athenians, horses were better admired from a distance than encountered up close. Crowds compounded the challenge. Morning in Athens meant farmers streaming in from the countryside with wagons full of produce, artisans lugging tools to workshops, and citizens converging on the agora or the pernix for political meetings. By midday, the streets were packed with buyers, sellers, and errand runners. Afternoons brought processions of students heading to lessons, while evenings saw tavern-goers staggering home. There was no quiet hour, no lull when the roads were clear. Movement in Athens was constant, and congestion was simply part of life. The lack of signage or addresses made navigation harder still. Visitors relied on landmarks. Turn left at the Hermes statue, then walk until you see the shrine with the olive garland. Locals developed a mental map of shortcuts through alleys and courtyards, shaving minutes off their journeys if they knew the right twists and turns. But this knowledge wasn't foolproof. One blocked cart, one wandering herd of goats, and your clever shortcut became an accidental detour. In Athens, even the best-planned commute came with surprises. Noise was unavoidable. The creak of carts, the bray of donkeys, the cries of merchants, and the chatter of pedestrians created a constant din. Commuters shouted to announce their approach, much like car horns today. Make way was the ancient equivalent of leaning on the horn, though it often had the same result. A few people moved aside, while others ignored you completely. Tempers frayed quickly. Shoving, swearing, and even fistfights broke out when traffic snarls dragged on too long. Daily travel wasn't just physical effort, it was emotional endurance. Despite the frustrations, Athenians adapted. They timed their journeys strategically, leaving early to beat the worst crowds or lingering at home until the roads thinned. They traveled in groups for safety, both from pickpockets and from the hazards of wandering animals. Slaves were dispatched as couriers, darting more nimbly through crowded lanes than their masters could. And above all, people learned patience. Complaining about traffic might feel modern, but Athenians grumbled plenty about their own donkey jams and bottlenecks. The commute also served as a social space. On the way to the agora or the fountain, you'd inevitably run into neighbors, exchange gossip, or pause to watch a street performance. Movement and community were intertwined. You couldn't simply pass through the city unnoticed. Every journey was punctuated by interactions, whether welcome or not. Athens wasn't designed for efficiency. It was designed for life lived in public, and commuting was as much about being seen as it was about arriving. Visitors often marveled at the chaos, describing Athens as a city bursting at the seams, alive with motion but lacking order. For Athenians themselves, the commute was simply part of their rhythm. The unpredictability wasn't a bug, it was a feature. To walk through Athens was to experience its pulse, the energy, the congestion, the unpredictability, and the constant reminder that you were one of thousands trying to squeeze through the same twisting streets. So yes, there were no cars, no buses, no traffic lights. But Athens still had its own version of rush hour, complete with jams, tempers, and the occasional roadside snack stolen by a passing donkey. The Athenians endured it with a mix of resignation and humor, proving that no matter the century, commuting has always been a test of patience. Athens liked to talk about equality. Every citizen had a voice. Every man could speak in the assembly. But the streets told a different story. Walk a few blocks, and you could feel the divide between rich and poor in the very stones under your sandals. Wealthy districts boasted wider lanes, sturdier houses, and cleaner surroundings. Poorer quarters were a tangled knot of cramped alleys, overcrowded homes, and smells that could knock you flat. One side smelled like wine, the other like yesterday's fish guts. The wealthiest Athenians lived in houses large enough to command space. These homes were built with stone foundations and sometimes even tiled roofs. their walls rising higher than those of their humbler neighbors. They clustered in districts where streets were slightly broader, allowing carts to pass without wedging themselves against walls. The lanes were better maintained too, swept more often, drained a little more efficiently, and less likely to host the ankle-deep mud or refuse puddles that plagued other neighborhoods. If you walked through a rich street, you noticed the difference in your nose first. Instead of the overpowering stench of rotting scraps, you might smell fresh-cut wood from new furniture, or the waft of wine being poured into amphorae. Poorer neighborhoods, by contrast, were jammed together like a pile of discarded sandals. Houses were small, their mud brick walls fragile and prone to crumbling. Families squeezed into tight spaces, sometimes with more people than rooms, and the lanes between houses were barely wide enough for two pedestrians to pass. Trash accumulated quickly, since residents had neither the means nor the manpower to haul it far. Chickens strutted freely, goats nosed into discarded scraps, and chamber pots emptied from upper stories made walking an adventure. Here the streets weren't just thoroughfares, they were dumping grounds, playgrounds, and sometimes even bedrooms when summer nights grew unbearably hot indoors. Lighting emphasized the divide. Wealthier areas with wider lanes caught more sunlight, giving them a feeling of openness. Poorer quarters remained shadowed for much of the day, the narrow alleys blocking out the sun and leaving the streets damp and dim. These differences weren't just aesthetic, they shaped daily life. In bright, airy districts, neighbors leaned out of upper windows to chat. In dark alleys, people huddled inside to escape the gloom. The kinds of activity reflected the gap too. Richer streets were quieter, their traffic limited to slaves running errands or carts delivering luxury goods like fine fabrics or amphorae of imported wine. Neighbors might pause to exchange pleasantries, but the atmosphere was restrained. Poorer streets, meanwhile, pulsed with noise and chaos. Workshops spilled into alleys with potters, smiths and cobblers hammering away just outside their doors. Children ran in packs, shouting over one another as they chased hoops or tossed knucklebones. Vendors hawked cheap food, figs, nuts, fried tidbits to anyone passing by. Arguments erupted in public, and disputes often resolved themselves with a mix of shouting and shoving. In these cramped lanes, privacy was a luxury no one could afford. Even the animals reflected the contrast. Wealthy households kept their animals tucked away in courtyards or stables, so their streets were spared the worst mess. Poorer quarters had no such boundaries. Donkeys dozed in the middle of alleys, goats chewed at doorframes, and stray dogs rummaged through piles of waste. Residents adapted, stepping carefully or simply ignoring the filth, but the result was unmistakable. One side of Athens smelled like fermenting grapes, the other like a menagerie had exploded. Festivals highlighted the divide most clearly. Processions through wealthier districts were orderly, with space for participants to march and spectators to stand aside. In poorer neighborhoods, festivals were claustrophobic spectacles. The procession squeezed through alleys barely wide enough for the musicians, while children darted in and out of the crowd, and spectators pressed shoulder to shoulder against walls. For the rich, festivals were a display of civic pride. For the poor, they were another excuse for chaos, joyful, but undeniably cramped. And yet the poor districts weren't without their own charms. The density of life created strong community ties. Neighbors shared food, water, and gossip freely, and the streets became communal living rooms. Doors were rarely shut, and everyone knew everyone else's business. Richer streets, by contrast, could feel more isolated. High walls shielded courtyards from view, and families kept their lives private. Wealth brought comfort, but not always camaraderie. For many Athenians, the energy of a bustling, noisy alley was preferable to the silence of a pristine lane. Still, the divide was unmistakable. Visitors could read a family's wealth simply by walking past their door. A solid, painted wall with a sturdy wooden entrance meant affluence. A crumbling mud brick facade patched with scraps meant poverty. The contrast wasn't subtle, and it reinforced the social order of the city every time someone walked its streets. The irony was that both sides were interdependent. The goods enjoyed in wealthy homes were produced in poor workshops. The food and wine consumed at elite banquets came through streets lined with cramped dwellings. The same city that boasted dazzling marble temples also depended on neighborhoods that smelled perpetually of fish guts and goat droppings. Athens' greatness rested on both the polished stones of its aristocrats and the crowded alleys of its workers. So when you imagine Athens, don't picture a uniform city of gleaming marble. Picture the divide. One district where wine poured smoothly into amphorae, another where refuse puddled in the street. One side measured life by luxury, the other by survival, and together they created the contradictions that made Athens what it was: brilliant, messy, and always split between elegance and filth. When we think of Athens, we imagine marble temples glowing on the Acropolis, great thinkers debating lofty truths, and orators crafting speeches that would echo for centuries. But none of that existed in a vacuum. It all grew out of the streets. Those twisting alleys, noisy marketplaces, and chaotic neighborhoods were more than just backdrops. They shaped the daily lives of Athenians, and in turn helped create the cultural, political, and intellectual legacy that the world still remembers. They gave us democracy, theater, and philosophy, but also mud, chaos, and goat poop. The streets of Athens were classrooms long before boys sat with teachers. Children absorbed the rhythms of debate by hearing men argue at fountains or in the agora. They learnt negotiation not from textbooks but from watching their mothers haggle for figs or their fathers curse over unfair prices. The streets weren't tidy, but they were alive, and in their noise and confusion, Athenians learned the skills of survival and persuasion that would eventually underpin their democracy. Politics, too, had its roots in these thoroughfares. While official assemblies met on the ponyx, the real testing ground for ideas was the street corner. Citizens practiced their oratory skills in public disputes, refining their ability to sway crowds long before stepping onto a formal stage. The constant exposure to shouting, heckling, and debating made Athenians unusually attuned to rhetoric. If you could survive a shouting match in the agora, facing 500 jurors was just another day at the office. The messy, loud streets were boot camps for democracy. Theatre didn't just emerge in the grand performance spaces. It thrived in the daily spectacle of the streets. Jugglers, acrobats, and storytellers brought myth and comedy into everyday life, while quarrels turned into public performances judged by whoever happened to be watching. The streets blurred the line between audience and actor, between civic duty and entertainment. This constant culture of performance prepared Athenians to appreciate, critique, and innovate in drama. The laughter of a crowd in the agora wasn't so different from laughter in the theatre. It was just less rehearsed and a lot dustier. Philosophy, too, owed a debt to the streets. Socrates didn't sit in a quiet garden waiting for students to approach. He stopped strangers in the middle of their commute and demanded they define justice while dodging chickens. The streets were his lecture hall, and the ordinary Athenians he pestered were his unwilling students. The messy, unpredictable environment forced thinkers to adapt their ideas to real life, to deal not just with abstract concepts but with the distractions of donkeys, vendors, and impatient bystanders. Philosophy wasn't some lofty escape from the chaos. It was forged in it. Yet the streets also carried less glamorous legacies. They taught Athenians resilience in the face of filth, disorder, and unpredictability, navigating muddy alleys, avoiding chamber pot dumps, and enduring the brays of donkeys all day demanded a kind of toughness. These weren't problems you solved, they were problems you lived with. Perhaps this constant friction prepared Athenians to endure greater challenges, from plagues to wars, with the same grit. A city that could function amid goat droppings and fish guts could certainly face the Persians. The inequality carved into the streets also left a lasting mark. The divide between rich, airy districts and cramped, smelly neighborhoods was stark, and it mirrored the divide in political and social power. Democracy promised equality, but the streets reminded everyone that equality had its limits. Citizens might gather in the same assembly, but they didn't walk home to the same conditions. That tension between ideals and realities was visible in every alley, and it became part of the Athenian story, inspiring both pride in their system and constant critique of its flaws. Even religion was shaped by the streets. Shrines and altars scattered through alleys meant the divine was inescapable. Athenians didn't have to travel to the Acropolis to feel the gods' presence. They encountered them daily in the corner herms and street corner offerings. The streets made religion a communal, visible practice, ensuring that piety wasn't private but woven into the urban fabric. And then there were the simple legacies of community. The fountains where women and slaves gathered for water were as important for gossip as for survival. The vendors in the agora didn't just sell, they connected people. Children forged friendships and rivalries in games that spilled into alleys. Even disputes settled by shouting matches contributed to a culture where everyone had a voice, even if it was sometimes raised at full volume. The streets didn't just hold Athens together physically, they held it together socially. Of course, we can't romanticize it too much. The streets were dirty, loud, and occasionally dangerous. They weren't designed for beauty or comfort, they were designed for survival. But in that survival, something extraordinary emerged. Athens' brilliance didn't rise despite the chaos of its streets. It rose because of it. The noise trained its citizens to speak and listen. The mess trained them to adapt. The crowds trained them to think of themselves as part of a larger whole. The goat poop just kept them humble. So when we look back at Athens, we see more than temples and philosophers. We see a city where mud and marble, donkeys and democracy, chaos and creativity coexisted on the same blocks. The legacy of Athenian streets wasn't just the birth of ideas. It was the messy, noisy, smelly environment that forced those ideas to matter. In the end, the streets of Athens gave us the world we know today. They were unpredictable, crowded, dirty, and alive. They taught Athenians how to argue, how to endure, and how to perform for an audience, whether in politics, theatre, or philosophy. And while we inherited their democracy, drama, and thought, we also inherited their reminder that great ideas rarely come from comfort. They come from the dust, the noise, and yes, the goat poop.